Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth. Where curiosity settles in, the noise of the day eases back a little, and the old world still has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. Tonight, our attention drifts somewhere quiet, somewhere stony, somewhere hidden so far from daylight that even now it feels slightly unreasonable that anyone would have gone there at all. Not just walked in a little way, mind you. Not just peered around the mouth of a cave and decided that was quite enough underground for one afternoon, but gone properly inward, into darkness, into silence, into a place that asks something of you the moment you enter it. And deep inside that place, long before farms, before cities, before writing, before roads, before metal, before history had learned to leave itself notes, something was built. That is the part that catches the mind. Not simply that an old cave exists, because caves are old by their very nature and rarely feel the need to apologise for it. Not that ancient people once passed through it, because human beings and our relatives have always had a habit of wandering into places that are either beautiful, dangerous, or deeply inconvenient. No, what catches the mind is that someone went into the underground dark and arranged things, deliberately, repeatedly, with effort, with purpose, even if we still cannot say with confidence what that purpose was. Deep inside Bruniquel Cave, far beyond the easy reach of the sun, there are structures made from broken stalagmites, organised in rings and segments, placed there by hands that belong to a world so remote it almost slips beyond imagination. Before we settle in with that though, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. What part of the world are you in right now, and what is the hour where you are? Perhaps it is late, and the day has begun to soften around the edges. Perhaps it is very early, and the light has not yet quite made up its mind. Perhaps outside your window there is traffic, rain, wind, a street lamp, a distant train, or the kind of silence that makes you suddenly aware of your own breathing. It is always a slightly lovely thing, I think, to consider that a story about deep time can arrive in so many modern rooms at once. One person listening under a blanket, another on a sofa, another in headphones while pretending to do something useful, another staring at the ceiling, thinking they are not tired, right up until they absolutely are. And if this quiet little descent into the past turns out to be a soothing way to end the day, or simply an interesting one, I'd be very glad if you gave the video a like, maybe subscribed, and stayed with this corner of the world for more of these slow journeys through science, history, and all the curious things the Earth has been keeping to itself. It helps more than you might think, and it allows this small calm place to find others who may need it. Which is a rather modern kind of magic when you think about it. Not as dramatic as discovering something astonishing in a prehistoric cave, perhaps, but still respectable. Now then, let us make our way underground. Caves have a very particular effect on the imagination. Even before you know anything scientific about them, before anyone starts discussing limestone, mineral deposits, groundwater, collapsed passages, or dating methods involving impressive machines and deeply patient researchers, a cave already does something to your mind. It narrows your world. It reduces the number of useful directions to one. It makes you notice the sound of your feet, the shape of the air, the way light behaves when it is no longer abundant and carefree but precious and limited. Above ground, space tends to feel open, negotiable, forgiving. Miss a turn on a hillside and you can usually correct it. Stand still in a field and the sky remains generous. But underground, especially once daylight is left behind, the world becomes immediate. Rock above, rock beside, rock under your hands, and beyond the reach of your lamp an old darkness waiting very politely, as if it has all the time in the world, which of course it does. That alone would make caves memorable. But they also do something else. They confuse our usual sense of time. Outside, time is measured with obvious markers, the changing angle of the sun, shadows moving across a floor, the cooling of evening, the noise of birds, the weather shifting by the hour, the season, the month. Underground, many of those signals fall away. A cave does not much care what century you have arrived from. It is one of the rare places where the modern world can feel strangely thin, where your phone, your schedule, your inbox, and your opinions about whether you have had enough water today all begin to lose some of their authority. In the dark, older things move forward. The body becomes aware of itself in a more primitive way. The mind becomes alert. A drip of water sounds louder than it should. A passage seems narrower than it looked a moment ago. An uneven floor demands attention. Even people who are not especially superstitious can become a little respectful underground. There is a reason for that. A cave reminds you, very efficiently, that the Earth was here first and remains under no obligation to explain itself. Now imagine not entering such a place as a tourist with electric light, proper footwear, and the comforting knowledge that someone has likely marked the route. Imagine entering it with fire. That changes the whole feeling at once. A modern beam of light is clean, strong, almost indifferent. It cuts the dark in a practical way. Firelight does something stranger. It flickers, it hesitates, it exaggerates surfaces, it turns stone into moving shadow, and moving shadow into possibilities. Distances become uncertain, shapes appear and vanish. The walls seem alive in a way that is technically unhelpful but undeniably memorable. And yet for most of our deep past, if anyone wished to go into a cave, fire was the companion that made it possible. Not comfortable perhaps, not easy, but possible. This matters because Bruniquel Cave is not the sort of place one stumbles through absent-mindedly while out for a leisurely wander. What gives the site its power, even before you get into the details of what was found there, is the setting itself. Deep inside a cave in what is now southern France, in a zone far removed from natural daylight, researchers found traces of deliberate construction. Broken stalagmites had been selected, moved, arranged, and organised into circular or ring-like structures. There were signs of fire, there was order, there was intention. And the age of it all would eventually push the story so far back that it began to press against one of our most comfortable assumptions. That the truly complex, planned, symbolic, or organised behaviours of this sort belong mainly to us, to Homo sapiens, to recent humans, to the neat self-portrait we like to hang in the hallway of history. It is always slightly awkward when prehistory rearranges the furniture of our pride. For a long time, many people preferred a version of the human story in which sophistication arrived late and belonged mostly to our own species. Before that, so the old attitude often ran, there were rougher beings living rougher lives, surviving but not quite imagining, using but not quite planning, reacting but not quite reflecting. They could hunt, yes. They could make tools, yes. They could endure cold and injury and uncertain weather in ways most of us would personally prefer to admire from a safe distance. But the deeper things, the things involving intention, ritual, abstraction, construction for reasons beyond immediate survival, those were often placed in a category labelled more or less ours. Then sites like Bruniquel begin clearing their throat. Because what do you do with a place that seems to show someone going far underground and building something there long before modern humans are thought to have occupied that region? What do you do with evidence that suggests planning, cooperation, movement of material, management of light or fire, and an ability to operate in a profoundly unfamiliar environment? What do you do with the fact that the builders were very likely Neanderthals, not pale shadows fumbling at the edge of human possibility, but people of another humankind who are capable of far more than old stereotypes allowed? The cave does not answer in words, naturally. Caves are famously unhelpful conversationalists. But it does answer in arrangement, in placement, in traces left where almost no accident could reasonably put them. And perhaps that is one reason this story settles into the mind so firmly. It is not merely old. Prehistory is full of old things, many of them very impressive. It is not merely mysterious. Archaeology could hardly take 2 steps without mystery peering out from behind a shard or a bone. What makes this different is that it feels like a gesture. Someone went inward and did something that did not need to happen by chance. Someone carried light into stone darkness and made a place within a place. Even if we do not yet know exactly why, the act itself feels meaningful. It suggests thought before action, decision before effort, perhaps even a shared idea held in several minds at once. That last part is especially striking. To build anything, even something modest, usually requires a little agreement. Not necessarily a committee, thankfully, because no one wants to imagine a Neanderthal planning meeting running long into the evening, but some coordination, some sense that these pieces belong here, this pattern matters, this work is being done for a reason. If that sounds ordinary, it is only because we are creatures who live among built environments. We are so surrounded by arranged matter that intention can become almost invisible. Walls, paths, steps, shelves, tables, towers, tunnels, doors, cities, bridges, fences, and everything else that says, someone decided this should be here. But to encounter such intention at immense distance in time, hidden inside a cave, is to feel the ordinary become strange again. Construction is no longer background. It becomes a signal, a message, a quiet declaration that thought was happening here. And there is another part of the Bruniquel story that makes it particularly good at lingering in the mind. We still do not know exactly what the structure was for. That uncertainty is not a weakness. In a way, it is what gives the site much of its power. Had the cave yielded something obvious, something that came with a tidy label saying shelter or storage or cooking area or ceremonial site, we would place it in the cabinet and move along. But Bruniquel resists tidy labelling. The structures are deep inside the cave, not where daily living would make easy sense. The environment is difficult, the effort is significant, the arrangement is deliberate, fire has been used, yet the purpose remains open. That gap between evidence and certainty is where the imagination becomes interested, provided it behaves itself and does not start inventing nonsense at a pace the facts cannot support. And the imagination, left unsupervised, does adore caves. It wants initiation rites, secret gatherings, symbols on walls, meetings of clans, sacred acts, practical experiments, territorial markers, shelter from weather, shelter from enemies, shelter from something unnamed, perhaps even simply the old and very human desire to go somewhere unusual and do something there because the place itself feels important. The truth may be simpler than any of that, or stranger, or both. Prehistory is not obliged to match our preferred stories. Still, even the most cautious scientific interpretation has to reckon with the plain force of the site. Deep underground, someone organised stone. It is worth pausing too over how far long before humans does and does not mean what it sounds like. In everyday speech, we often use the word human rather narrowly, meaning us, modern humans, Homo sapiens, the self-conscious apes with smartphones, opinions about coffee, and a frankly remarkable tendency to assume we invented depth of mind. But the deeper story of humanity is not so tidy. Neanderthals were not aliens, nor were they a trial run with poor branding. They were human relatives, close enough that our histories are entangled, close enough that we can no longer pretend the family tree is simple. So when we say something was built long before humans in the everyday sense, what we really mean is long before modern human civilization, long before recorded history, long before our kind became the dominant storytellers of the planet. Yet the makers were not outside the human story. They were within it, just farther back and on a neighbouring branch. That distinction matters because Bruniquel does not merely invite wonder, it asks for correction. It nudges us away from the old ladder-like view of the past, where everything climbs neatly toward us as the final clever result. The deeper we look, the less that view survives. Intelligence is not a single spotlight switching on in one species at one glorious moment. It appears in forms, in degrees, in contexts. Skill, memory, planning, adaptation, cooperation, technical knowledge, attention to place, familiarity with materials, All these things may exist long before someone leaves behind writing or monumental architecture or a sufficiently flattering autobiography. And caves, for whatever reason, are good at keeping such corrections intact. Underground conditions can preserve what the open air would quickly scatter or erase. That does not make caves easy archives. Rather the opposite. They can collapse, flood, conceal, distort, and generally behave like difficult librarians. But when something survives there, it can emerge with surprising force. A footprint, a painting, a hearth, a bone, a wall marked by smoke, a circle of broken stalagmites. The underground world has a way of holding on to gestures that vanished elsewhere. There is something almost comically humbling in the fact that we spend so much of modern life trying to make our environments brighter, faster, cleaner, more efficient, more connected. And then from time to time a revelation arrives from a dark hole in a hillside. Not from a gleaming new city, not from a boardroom, not from a digital archive humming away in perfect climate control, but from a cave. A cave with mud, stone, mineral growth, awkward footing, and an entrance that gives no hint, at first glance, of how far the story goes. You rather have to admire the Earth's sense of presentation. Just when we begin feeling terribly advanced, it quietly clears away a little dust and says, "You might want to look at this." And when we do look, when we imagine the builders there, the scene becomes difficult to forget. Not because we can reconstruct it in every detail. We cannot. The cave keeps much to itself, but the fragments are enough to start the mind working in a disciplined way. A group entering with fire, the careful movement into darkness, the selection of stalagmites, not random stones gathered in haste, breaking, transporting, placing, perhaps pauses for light, for smoke, for footing, for communication in voices now lost. Perhaps several visits rather than one. Perhaps an understanding of the cave already built through prior journeys inward. Underground work is rarely efficient if done by people who do not know the place. It is one thing to reach a chamber. It is another to return to it with intent. And so the opening of this story is not just about age, though age matters. It is not just about Neanderthals, though they matter. It is not just about a French cave, though the cave itself is central. It is about the moment a piece of evidence forces us to widen the frame, to imagine minds in deep time doing more than surviving the day, to accept that long before the familiar world of villages and writing and metal tools and recorded names, there were people moving through darkness with purpose enough to build. That should not feel like a small thing. It is not a small thing. It also prepares us quietly for the way this story unfolds, because Bruniquel does not reveal itself all at once. First comes the place, then the oddity of what was found, then the deeper question of how anyone knew its age, then the still deeper question of who could have made it, and after that perhaps the most tantalizing question of all. Why? Why go so far into a cave? Why arrange broken stalagmites into rings? Why use fire there? Why that chamber? Why that effort? Why at all? Those are the questions waiting ahead, and they are good questions precisely because they do not rush. A site like this has to be approached with patience. The temptation is always to leap to the dramatic conclusion, to skip ahead to revelation, astonishment, a neatly packaged lesson about intelligence and prehistory, and the many ways the past still catches us underprepared. But the better way, I think, is slower. Walk in first. Let the cave become a cave. Let the dark become dark. Let the distance from daylight matter. Let the mind feel how unusual the act itself would have been. Only then does the arrangement of stone begin to carry its full weight. So for now, as the outside world grows quieter and the room around you perhaps a little softer, hold on to the central image. Deep underground, in a chamber where sunlight never reached, someone long ago built something out of stone formations taken from the cave itself. Not carelessly, not accidentally, built. And if that word feels too modern, too architectural, too clean for the rough old business of prehistory, then perhaps that is part of the lesson already. We think we know what building belongs to. We think we know whose hands get to occupy that category. Then Bruniquel waits in the dark, patient as ever, and suggests that the story began earlier and farther underground than we had been telling it, which means that before we ask what those rings meant, or how they were dated, or why they changed the picture of Neanderthals so dramatically, we should probably stand for a moment at the threshold itself and consider the cave, the land around it, the hidden entrance, and the long path inward that made all the rest possible. So let us stay with that threshold a little longer, because the place itself matters more than it might seem at first. Before Bruniquel Cave became a scientific headline, before it became a debate about Neanderthals and planning and firelight, and the deep history of human behaviour, it was simply part of a landscape in southwestern France, near the village of Bruniquel in the Tarn-et-Garonne, in a region shaped by limestone, river valleys, cliffs and the gorges of the Aveyron. The village still sits above dramatic terrain, with steep slopes and old stone architecture looking out over the valley, and the broader area is already known for its rich prehistoric record. In other words, this was not some random hole in the ground that happened to get lucky. It belongs to a region where the past has a habit of staying close to the surface, even when the most astonishing part of the story turns out to be hidden far below it. That setting is useful to hold in the mind because it stops the cave from becoming too mythical too quickly. Bruniquel is real ground, real stone, real weather, real slopes. If you stood above it on an ordinary day, you would not see a glowing sign reading one of the strangest prehistoric sites in Europe this way. You would see a landscape that has been lived in, walked through, defended, farmed, admired, and weathered for a very long time. The village itself is known today as a historic hilltop place, the sort of settlement that makes people slow down, look at the walls, and briefly imagine they might like a simpler life until they remember central heating. Yet tucked within that older countryside is a cave system that remained closed off for an immense span of time, sealed by natural collapse since the Pleistocene, hidden not because anyone meant to hide it, but because geology is excellent at closing the door and then refusing to discuss the matter further. That natural closing is one of the most important details in the whole Bruniquel story. According to the 2016 Nature paper, the cave had been shut off since the Pleistocene, and no humans entered it between that natural closure and its discovery in 1990. That means the underground environment was not being casually disturbed over the centuries by shepherds, treasure hunters, curious children, amateur torchbearers, or the usual assortment of people who see a dark opening and think, sensibly or otherwise, let's go in there. The cave was not part of an unbroken chain of local visitation. It was sealed, preserved and left to itself, and in archaeology that matters enormously. A site that has been closed off is a site that has a chance, however rare, to keep its evidence in something like context rather than having it trampled, rearranged, looted or decorated with initials and very poor taste. Hidden places are often less dramatic in reality than they are in the imagination. Usually a lost place turns out to be mildly inconvenient rather than romantically inaccessible. A path is overgrown, a wall has collapsed, a route is narrow, muddy or blocked by rock that does not care how much significance lies beyond it. Bruniquel seems to have been hidden in exactly that practical way. The entrance was collapsed, and after the cave's discovery, local cavers had to dig through it, creating a narrow passage about 30 metres long before reaching the main gallery. There is something rather fitting in that. One of the oldest known built spaces in human history was not rediscovered by some theatrical unveiling of stone doors at sunset, but by patient work through rubble. Archaeology often arrives like that, with less trumpet music than one hopes, and more dirt than one expects. Even so, the word hidden is entirely fair here. Not hidden in the sense of deliberate secrecy, but hidden by time, by collapse, by the ordinary obstinacy of rock. If a cave mouth is small, blocked, or disguised by the shape of the hillside, then this entire underground world can sit only meters away from the open air, and remain effectively absent from human life. That contrast is part of what makes caves so unsettling and so compelling. A field, a village, a path, a line of trees, a river running in the valley, and then beneath all of that an environment with its own temperature, its own acoustics, its own slow mineral logic. Above ground, seasons pass visibly. Underground, change keeps happening. But in the patient language of calcite, drips, deposits, and silence. And silence, I think, is worth dwelling on in a place like this. Not because silence in caves is absolute, which it rarely is. There are drips, movements of air, the sound of feet, the scrape of fabric, the small mechanical tragedies of modern humans trying not to slip. But cave silence is different from surface silence. Outside, even a quiet place is full of distance. Wind has room to travel, birds interrupt, water can be heard from somewhere beyond sight, far-off noises still belong to the same broad world as you. Underground, the world narrows, sound folds in. A quiet cave does not feel empty, it feels contained, and in that containment, the hiddenness of Bruniquel becomes easier to understand emotionally, not just physically. It is not only that the cave was blocked, it is that once you go into such a place, you feel immediately that it belongs to another order of experience. The sunlight world ends quickly, the underground world begins without ceremony. The geography around Bruniquel makes that transition all the more striking. This is limestone country, cave country. The sort of terrain in which water over long stretches of time becomes a sculptor more patient than any artist and more relentless than any engineer. Limestone landscapes invite the underground into being. Water seeps, dissolves, hollows, enlarges, deposits. Passageways form. Chambers grow, stalactites hang, stalagmites rise. The rock records not only pressure and age but movement, chemistry, repetition. So when we speak of Bruniquel Cave, we are really speaking about a geological process that was already ancient long before any Neanderthal walked in with fire, and even longer before any modern scientist crouched over the floor with measuring tools, and the particular expression people get when they suspect the past is about to embarrass their assumptions. The cave is not just a container for archaeology, it is part of the story, because the material inside it, including the stalagmites later broken and arranged into structures, was produced by the cave itself over spans of time so long that human generations barely register against them. That self-contained quality matters. The builders, whoever they were at the time of action, and however we interpret their motives, were not bringing in a convenient pile of stone from outside. They were entering a space already shaped by geological growth, and then using elements of that space as construction material. That makes the cave feel less like a backdrop, and more like a partner in the event. Not a willing partner, perhaps. Caves never exactly volunteer. But a physical world already filled with columns, curtains, deposits and mineral formations, out of which a later act of intention would emerge. There is a practical simplicity to that. If you are deep underground and you want stone, the cave has thought of that. But there is also a conceptual strangeness. The structure at Bruniquel was built from the cave's own body, in the cave's own darkness, in a chamber the sun never touched. One of the gentler traps in thinking about prehistoric places is imagining that remote always means difficult to locate on a modern map. In truth, a site can be geographically modest and still feel conceptually remote beyond measure. Bruniquel is not some inaccessible polar void. It lies in a region people can visit, near a real village with real roads and real tourism offices, and, as it happens, a local exhibition devoted to the cave because the cave itself is not open to the public while scientific work continues. That detail has its own quiet effect on the story. The cave exists, but most people will never walk through it. The nearest many visitors will get is an exhibition in the Bruniquel castles. There is something fitting about that arrangement. The place remains partly withheld. You can know of it, study it, imagine it, learn from it, but not simply wander in and stand where the structures stand. Some places remain scientific sites first, and visitor experiences second, and Bruniquel very much belongs in that category. That inaccessibility preserves a certain seriousness. It keeps the cave from becoming too comfortable in the imagination. Tourist caves, lovely as they may be, often domesticate the underground. Railings, lights, timed entry, neat pathways, explanatory panels, perhaps a family and matching jackets discussing whether the gift shop will have magnets. All perfectly respectable, but not quite the same thing as a sealed prehistoric cave opened through collapse and studied because what lies inside may alter our sense of what ancient people could do. Bruniquel remains closer to the latter mood. Its hiddenness has not entirely ended just because it has been discovered. In a sense, it is still hidden from ordinary experience, which is perhaps one reason it retains so much power in the mind. And the mind does begin to adjust once it lingers on the entrance problem. The Nature paper notes that after the collapsed opening had been dug through, people could reach the main gallery via a narrow passage, and from there the structures lay 336 metres from the entrance, after what the researchers describe as an easy walk through chambers rich in speleothems. Easy walk is one of those scientific phrases that deserves affectionate caution. In cave terms, it may be entirely true. In ordinary living room terms, a 336-metre journey underground into chambers decorated with mineral growth and beyond the reach of daylight remains quite a proposition, especially if one imagines doing it without modern lighting, maps, or the gentle reassurance of knowing the batteries are full. Still, the phrasing matters because it reminds us that the cave was not some impossible vertical nightmare requiring advanced acrobatics and a complete disregard for self-preservation. Once inside, the route to the main gallery and onward to the relevant chamber was navigable. That fact may help explain why ancient people could appropriate the space at all. It was deep, yes, but not inaccessible in every sense. It was usable, and that makes it all the more interesting. Near the entrance, the researchers also found signs that the cave had hosted other life long before its modern rediscovery, remains of large Pleistocene fauna, and traces left by bears, including hibernation hollows, claw marks, and a few footprints. That detail does something useful to the mental picture. It reminds us that caves are never purely human theatres. They are ecological places as well as archaeological ones. Before science enters with notebooks, before prehistory enters with questions, a cave may have been home, shelter, den, trap, refuge, seasonal pause or silent chamber for animals entirely uninterested in participating in future academic arguments. Brown bears, in particular, have their own long history with caves, and their traces near the entrance add another layer to Bruniquel's atmosphere. This was not a tidy underground hall waiting politely for a revelation. It was part of a much older world of occupation, movement, and intermittent use by different beings over very long spans. The hills around Bruniquel, then, are not just scenic setting. They are the surface expression of a deeper system, one in which rock, water, gravity, collapse, and time created a hidden interior that would eventually preserve evidence of purposeful activity from around 176,500 years ago. That number is staggering enough in itself, but it becomes even more vivid when attached to a place. Numbers can float away if left alone. A cave gives them weight. 176,000 years is no longer just an age. It becomes a real underground distance from a real entrance in a real landscape near a real village in southern France. That groundedness matters, because the more astonishing the claim, the more firmly it should be tied to place. Bruniquel is astonishing precisely because it is not a mythic anywhere. It is a specific cave in a specific hill country, and that specificity is what lets the evidence stand. There is also a more human dimension to hiddenness that this cave brings out. We often speak as though discovery happens in a single moment, a dramatic before and after, but most discoveries are slower and less theatrical. A cave may be found, then entered, then mapped, then questioned, then only years later properly understood. Bruniquel followed something like that pattern. The cave was discovered in 1990, but the full significance of the structures deep inside would not be pinned down immediately. Early work in the 1990s documented the site, and later studies, especially the uranium-series dating published in 2016, established the extraordinary age that transformed Bruniquel from curious site to major prehistoric landmark. That long interval is a good reminder that archaeology often discovers a thing twice, once physically and later intellectually. First, the cave is opened. Then, years afterward, its meaning is opened, and perhaps that is exactly the right pace for a cave like this. It should resist easy understanding. A hidden place that reveals everything at once would feel almost impolite. Better that it emerge slowly, by degrees, giving the modern mind time to adjust. First, the knowledge that there is a cave, then the route inward, then the chamber, then the structures, then the age, then the realization that the builders were almost certainly Neanderthals. Each step requires a small revision of expectation. By the time one reaches the full picture, the mind has had to travel almost as carefully as the feet once did. Still, none of that fully captures the strange modesty of the entrance itself. It is easy to focus on the structures, as of course we eventually must, but there is something quietly moving about the fact that this whole revelation depended on a blocked opening in a hillside. For tens of thousands of years, perhaps more than 100,000 after the builders' fires had gone cold, the evidence remained there while weather shifted, animals moved, climates changed, human species came and went, languages formed, villages rose, kingdoms fought, roads were cut, churches built, towers repaired, revolutions argued, trains invented, radios crackled, and eventually people in synthetic jackets and proper boots returned underground, carrying instruments the Neanderthals could not have imagined. All that time, the cave simply kept its own counsel. That is what hidden can mean at geological scale, not merely out of sight, but out of history until history becomes curious enough to dig. By now then, the hills of Bruniquel should feel less like a picturesque backdrop, and more like a lid over something deliberate. A medieval-looking surface world above, a prehistoric underground world below, and between them a collapsed entrance that once made the lower one inaccessible to the upper. The modern village, the valley, the cliffs, the Averan landscape, the old limestone country, all these are part of the story because they tell us where the hiddenness happened. Yet the real strangeness still waits farther in. The place was concealed, yes. It was sealed, yes. It belonged to a cave-rich landscape and a region full of prehistory, yes. But the reason Bruniquel lingers in the mind is not merely that it was hidden. It is that after one passes into it and leaves the surface behind, there comes a point where daylight itself no longer matters, and that is where the story begins to change its scale. What matters now is the point at which a cave stops feeling like a sheltered extension of the outside world and becomes something else entirely. Near an entrance, even a small one, there is usually still some sense of orientation. Light reaches in, however weakly. Shadows soften rather than disappear. The body still understands where the open air is. You can glance back and reassure yourself that the world of trees, sky, weather and ordinary decisions has not vanished completely. But Bruniquel is not important because something happened near its mouth. It is important because the structures lie 336 meters from the entrance, and because the cave's own reconstructed entrance during the time of Neanderthal use appears to have been less than 2 meters high, which means the space behind it would have become dark very quickly. This was not a matter of lingering in a dim overhang. It was a matter of moving well past the reach of natural light into the dark part of the cave. That detail can sound technical on paper. 336 meters, less than 2 meters high, dark part of the antechamber, deep cast space. The language is careful and correct, but it does not fully convey what those facts mean in practice. Once daylight falls away in a cave, it falls away absolutely. Your eyes do not negotiate with total darkness. They do not work a little harder and save the day. They simply stop being useful until there is light again. That is why Bruniquel matters so much. The site shows not merely presence in a cave, but mastery of an underground environment that required lighting. The 2016 Nature paper framed the structure's location as evidence that people of this period had already mastered the underground environment, and the later 2026 work on the entrance reinforces the point by showing just how quickly darkness would have taken over beyond the low cave mouth. That difference between dimness and darkness is worth holding on to because it changes the whole character of the journey inward. A person or small group can drift into the front of a cave almost casually. Shelter is useful. Shade is useful. Protection from rain is useful. Many cave entrances and rock shelters become part of ordinary life for exactly those reasons. But to continue into a place where no daylight reaches is another matter. That requires intention before the first step. It requires some source of light. It requires enough fuel for that light. It requires enough familiarity with the route not to turn the return journey into a problem with very unpleasant consequences. And it requires a reason. You do not go that far underground by accident in the way one wanders too far down a pleasant path and suddenly realizes lunch was 2 hours ago. At Bruniquel, the distance itself is evidence of deliberate action, and that is one reason researchers describe the site as the oldest evidence of deep cave use by early Neanderthals. The cave was discovered in 1990 after local cavers dug through a narrow collapsed entrance passage roughly 30 metres long. From there people could reach the main gallery, and from there continue through chambers rich in speleothems until they arrived at the area containing the structures. The 2016 paper even describes the route from the reopened entrance to the structures as an easy walk, which is an admirably composed thing for archaeologists to say about a journey that leads into complete darkness through a sealed prehistoric cave. Easy by cave standards, then. Still, that phrase tells us something important. The structures were not placed in a tiny crack barely reachable by contortion. They were in a part of the cave that could be reached, used, and perhaps revisited, which makes their existence more plausible and their implications even stronger. If the route was navigable, then deep entry was not an extraordinary one-off stunt. It was a practical act carried out in an underground space that could, with light and planning, be occupied. It also helps to remember that Bruniquel did not begin as a human environment. Near the entrance, the 2016 study reports remains of large Pleistocene fauna and traces left by bears, including hibernation hollows, claw marks, and a few footprints. In other sectors of the cave, bear traces were present as well. That matters because it places the human use of the cave within a broader pattern of animal use, and because it gives the underground setting a little of its original roughness back. This was not a polished chamber prepared for symbolic performance by the cave management department. It was a natural underground system, already part of the lives of other creatures, already shaped by dampness, calcite growth, unstable surfaces, and the kind of enclosed acoustics that make every small movement feel larger than it is. When Neanderthals entered such a place, they were not stepping into a blank space. They were moving into an environment that demanded caution and attention from the start. Now picture the practical reality of getting beyond daylight in that environment. You enter low. The mouth behind you begins to shrink. Whatever exterior brightness there was stops helping sooner than you expect, especially if the entrance is small and the passage turns or narrows. The floor is not a hallway. The air is cooler and steadier. Moisture glints where the light reaches, and then does not glint at all because there is no light left to catch it. If you have only one fire source, its management matters. If the flame weakens, the world contracts instantly. If smoke gathers, breathing becomes part of the calculation. If you are carrying fuel, then every metre inward is also a question of whether enough remains for the return. None of that is speculative in the dramatic sense. It is simply what total darkness does. It converts movement into logistics. That is why the Bruniquel site is so revealing. The presence of constructions and heated areas deep inside the cave means that the problem of darkness was solved Not once, but well enough for activity to continue there. There is an easy mistake modern minds can make here, and it usually comes from familiarity with electric light. We imagine darkness as a switch we can reverse at will. We're used to corridors brightening because a motion sensor noticed our existence. We're used to phones that can produce a small emergency sun with no ceremony at all. Underground, 176,500 years ago, none of that convenience existed. Light had to be made, maintained, protected, and brought inward. Fire was not an accessory to cave use. It was the condition that made cave use possible. At Bruniquel, the structures themselves preserve traces of heating, with many speleofacts reddened or blackened, and the researchers identified charred material and heated bone in association with the constructions. Those traces do more than suggest that fire was present. They suggest that fire was used within the working life of the site itself, as part of whatever activity took place there. And once that is clear, the psychological side of the journey becomes harder to ignore. A deep cave is not just dark, it is isolating in a way surface places almost never are. There is no horizon to reassure you, no moon, no weather to read, no clue from the sky about time passing. Once inside, the outside world is reduced to memory and direction. That is one reason archaeologists have long treated deep cave use as a meaningful threshold in human behaviour. It involves confidence, planning, and social coordination. Even today, most people prefer not to walk into total darkness unless someone has offered a very convincing reason and perhaps a helmet. Bruniquel suggests that Neanderthals did exactly that, and not just for a momentary inspection. They went far enough into the cave to arrange material there, to heat material there, and to leave behind evidence that remained sealed until the modern reopening of the cave. The later study of the cave entrance sharpens this picture in a useful way. By reconstructing the evolution of the entrance and dating the closure of the cave to before, about 142,900 years ago, the 2026 research independently confirmed that the traces inside must belong to a much earlier period, and also emphasised that the paleo cave entrance was small enough that darkness would have set in rapidly behind it. This may sound like a narrow geomorphological point, but it is actually central. It tells us that the cave, even when accessible to Neanderthals, did not present itself as a broad, daylight-flooded shelter, extending gently inward. It became dark quickly. So when people moved deeper, they were truly committing themselves to the subterranean environment from the start. That makes the appropriation of the inner cave more impressive, not less. It also forces us to be disciplined about what can and cannot be said. We do not know exactly how the Neanderthal lit their way at Bruniquel. The evidence does not hand us a neat equipment list. We do not know how many individuals took part in any one visit. We do not know whether the deepest zone was used once, often, seasonally, or under circumstances we have not yet imagined correctly. But some inferences are hard to avoid. Moving 336 metres into darkness, manipulating cave formations there, and using fire there imply route memory, fuel planning, and a shared practical understanding of how to behave in an environment where a mistake is more serious than it would be outside. Even if the route was physically manageable, deep cave use is not casual. It is organised. And organisation is part of what Bruniquel has been quietly telling us all along. Another important point sits in the background here. Bruniquel did not become famous merely because Neanderthals were in a cave. Neanderthals are known from many caves and rock shelters across Europe and Western Asia. The special significance of Bruniquel is that the use occurred beyond the zone exposed to daylight and involved elaborate structures made from hundreds of broken stalagmites, along with intentionally heated areas. The LSCE summary of the nature work put it very directly. The site reveals the appropriation of a deep karst space, including lighting, by a pre-modern human species. That is what lifts Bruniquel out of the category of interesting habitation evidence and into the category of behaviour that forces a reassessment. It is not just underground presence, it is underground purpose, and there is something deeply useful in focusing on purpose before focusing on the structures themselves. The mind always wants to skip ahead to the rings, because the rings are the thing people remember. They are concrete, strange, visual. They look built, and therefore they attract the imagination immediately. But the dark comes first. The dark is the price of admission to the whole story. Before any speleofact was placed, before any heated zone marked the floor or the stone, someone had to decide that the deep interior of the cave was worth entering. That decision may have been practical, social, symbolic, or something that sits awkwardly between those categories. But whatever the motive, the route inward had to be accepted as part of the task. In that sense, the first structure at Bruniquel may not have been the stone ring at all. It may have been the act of organised entry itself, the light carried in, the path remembered, the deep chamber made reachable by knowledge. If that sounds a little modern, it may only be because we often underestimate how much infrastructure can exist without walls, roads, or written plans. A route known by a group is a kind of infrastructure. A repeated movement into a dangerous place is a kind of infrastructure. A shared understanding that one person carries light, another fuel, another watches footing, another knows when to stop, is a kind of infrastructure too. Bruniquel does not preserve those behaviours directly, but it preserves the consequences of them. The deep chamber did not organise itself. The stalagmites did not break and line up out of enthusiasm. The heated areas did not politely appear because the cave fancied a little drama. Every physical trace points back to deliberate action, in a place where deliberate action was costly. That is why the loss of daylight is not a mood-setting detail. It is the central condition that gives the site its force. And perhaps that is why this section of the story feels so quietly unsettling. Once you accept how dark the cave would have become, the old habit of treating deep prehistory as vaguely instinctive begins to wear thin. People do not master deep underground spaces by instinct alone. They do it by knowledge, by repetition, by cooperation, and by a level of practical confidence that has to be learned somewhere. Bruniquel does not tell us everything about that learning, but it proves enough of it happened. A group of Neanderthals did not merely survive in a harsh Ice Age world above ground. At some point around 176,500 years ago, they also moved deep beneath it with light, with purpose, and with enough control to leave behind something that still startles us now. So when we picture the next stage of this journey, it should not begin with the structures appearing suddenly like some theatrical reveal. It should begin with the last traces of daylight giving up. It should begin with a small pool of firelight pushing against mineral walls, with the chamber ahead still hidden, with each step taken because someone already believed there was something worth doing farther in. Only after that, only when the outer world has fully disappeared and the cave has become a place lit by intention rather than by the sun, do the arranged forms on the floor come into view. By the time anyone reached the chamber where the structures stand, the outside world would have been gone in every practical sense. No hint of the sky remained. No useful light came from behind. Whatever guided the final stretch inward had to be carried, protected and maintained by the people entering the cave, and that is part of why the first sight of the Bruniquel structures matters so much. They do not appear in a place where accident feels likely. They appear in a place reached only through intention. Deep inside the cave, 336 metres from the entrance, explorers found not a scatter of broken stone, not a convenient shelter, not the sort of natural clutter one can dismiss with a shrug, but a set of forms that immediately suggested arrangement. 2 annular constructions, 4 smaller accumulations and traces of fire were waiting there in the dark, preserved because the cave had later been sealed. The setting alone makes the discovery unusual. The geometry of what was found is what makes it extraordinary. It is useful before letting the imagination do what imagination does best, to look carefully at what was actually there. The main structure is not a towering monument or anything remotely theatrical. It is low, built from broken stalagmites laid in aligned and superimposed rows. The larger annular formation measures about 6.7 by 4.5 metres, and the smaller one about 2.2 by 2.1 metres. Around them sit 4 additional accumulation structures, with 2 positioned inside the larger ring and 2 outside it. The pieces used to build them were not random pebbles or blocks. They were sections of stalagmites, many of them carefully broken into lengths that were surprisingly consistent. The total inventory comes to roughly 400 pieces, with a combined length of about 112 metres and an estimated mass of around 2.2 metric tons. Even on paper, that stopped sounding like chance very quickly. This is one of the reasons the researchers coined the term speleofacts for the pieces. The word has a faintly scientific elegance to it, but behind it is a simple problem. The usual categories were not quite enough. These were not ordinary stones carried in from outside. They were not naturally fallen rubble in any casual sense either. They were cave formations deliberately selected from the cave itself, broken, moved, and arranged. In some places, the components were laid in one layer, in others in 2, 3, or even 4 superimposed layers. Some smaller pieces seem to have been inserted like filler, and in several places larger pieces were propped against the sides as if to stabilise the layout. Nearby, researchers identified traces where stalagmites appear to have been removed from the floor. That combination of extraction, calibration, transport, and placement is exactly what makes the structures feel so arrestingly human in logic, even before one begins arguing about symbolism or purpose. And then there is the regularity. Archaeologists are trained to be suspicious of neat stories, and rightly so. Nature produces patterns all the time. Water lays down lines, gravity sorts debris, crystals grow with admirable confidence. Animals create repeated features in ways that can be surprising, so one must be careful not to see design everywhere. Bruniquel holds up under that caution rather well. The researchers emphasise the regular geometry of the annular forms, the way the pieces were aligned and juxtaposed, and the deliberate placement of support elements. The average lengths of the broken stalagmite sections are not wildly chaotic either. According to the reported inventory, the large ring is built from pieces averaging about 34.4 centimetres, while the smaller structure uses pieces averaging around 29.5 centimetres. That is not the sort of tidy consistency one expects from random breakage followed by natural drift. It looks instead like somebody preferred a workable size and then kept producing it, which is the sort of behaviour that starts to sound less like accident and more like construction. It also helps to imagine how these rings would have looked in firelight. We know from the site evidence that fire was present. Many of the speleofacts show heat alteration. Some are reddened, others blackened, and burned organic material, including fragments of bone, was found in association with the structures. The heated zones are not spread randomly across the chamber in a way that would suggest a careless passing blaze. They cluster on the speleofacts themselves, with a char concentration mainly of burnt bone fragments noted on the ground near one of the structures. So the chamber was not merely entered and admired in darkness, it was lit, heated in places, and used actively enough to leave thermal traces that could still be read many thousands of years later. In practical terms, that means the rings were not inert forms noticed on a single brief visit. They were part of an occupied event. Fire and architecture met there, however modest both may have looked to the eye. One of the most striking parts of the Bruniquel story is that the structures are at once humble and difficult to dismiss. They're not polished. They are not symmetrical in the modern geometric sense. They do not announce themselves with ornament. They are built from rough cave material by people who are not trying to impress future museum designers. Yet the more closely they are described, the harder it becomes to explain them away. Hundreds of stalagmite pieces, more or less calibrated, moved into ring-like forms, layered, supported and associated with fire. It is the cumulative weight of those details that matters. A single, broken stalagmite means nothing. A few scattered pieces mean little. a deliberate arrangement of hundreds of them in annular formations deep underground, becomes a different category of evidence altogether. That is why the team treated the structures as anthropogenic, and why Bruniquel has become such an important site in discussions of Neanderthal behaviour. There has naturally been scepticism, because any claim this surprising should be tested from every angle. One objection raised in public discussion was whether cave bears, which are known from the site, could somehow have created similar patterns while denning. Bears do indeed leave traces in caves. They scratch walls, hollow out resting places, disturb sediment, and generally behave with the confidence of creatures who have no interest in future peer review. But the case for the Bruniquel structures being human-made does not rest on wishful thinking. It rests on the annular forms, the stacked and aligned pieces, the support elements, the calibrated lengths, and the traces of fire. As the National Geographic summary of the work noted, bears do not stack stalagmites into ring constructions, and they do not make fire. A bear den can be messy. It does not become architecture simply by being old. That last point matters because the rings at Bruniquel are not compelling merely as shapes. They are compelling as evidence of repeated decisions. First a stalagmite had to be chosen, then broken, then perhaps trimmed or sorted, then carried, then placed where it contributed to a larger form, then another, and another, hundreds of times. Even if we imagine a very small, low construction, the amount of labour involved is obvious. Around 2.2 metric tons of material do not quietly organise themselves while no one is looking. Nor does such a process fit comfortably into the old caricature of Neanderthals as brilliant only in immediate survival and not in planned collective action. The structures imply planning before movement, and perhaps planning spread across multiple visits. They imply that someone had an image, however rough, of the form being made. They imply that a place in the cave was being treated as a destination rather than simply as empty floor. There is also something quietly revealing in the scale. The large ring, at roughly 6.7 by 4.5 metres, is big enough to be spatial rather than token. The smaller ring, and the accumulations around it, suggest that this was not one isolated gesture, but a set of related arrangements. In other words, the cave chamber was not marked once and abandoned in the same breath. It was organised. The presence of two piles inside the larger annular structure is especially interesting, because it hints at differentiated use of interior and exterior space, though one must be careful not to claim too much. Perhaps the piles supported something. Perhaps they served as a focal points for fire or placement. Perhaps they were simply part of the same construction logic extended inward. The truth is that we do not know, but not knowing the purpose is different from not recognising the order. The order is plainly there, and once seen, it becomes very difficult to unsee. The traces of heat add another layer of difficulty to any simple explanation. 57 pieces are reported as reddened and 66 as blackened, with burnt organic material found nearby, including a bone fragment. Heat also fractured some calcite. This matters because fire underground is not incidental in the same way a surface hearth might be. Below daylight, fire is part tool, part protection, part orientation, and perhaps more besides. At Bruniquel, the signs of heating are located on the structures themselves rather than in some entirely separate patch of floor, which suggests that the rings and the fires belong to the same behavioural episode or to repeated related episodes. They were part of the site's use, not simply later contamination from unrelated activity. Again, that does not tell us whether the rings were practical, social, symbolic, technical, or something we do not yet have the right category for. But it does tell us they were active places, not passive curiosities. One can imagine, without slipping into fantasy, how strange the chamber must have looked when it was alive with use. Low walls of pale calcite sections laid in rings, propped pieces catching the flicker of flame, blackened surfaces where soot or heat had altered the mineral, bone or other fuel burning and dimming. Shadows moving across the chamber in a way that would make every edge seem less stable, and every circle more deliberate. Unlike open-air structures, cave constructions are seen at close range, in constrained light. Their effect would have been immediate. There would have been no wide scenic view, no admiring approach from a hill. You would encounter them almost suddenly within the reach of your own light. That may be one reason the site still feels so intimate despite its age. It is not grand in the sense of later monuments. It is close, enclosed, and bodily. Someone built a place within the cave, and anyone standing there would have experienced it from inside the same darkness. The scientific team was careful not to oversell what the rings mean, and that caution is part of what makes their conclusions persuasive. They did not claim to know exactly what function the structures served. They considered shelter unlikely because of the distance from the entrance. They raised possibilities including technical uses, water-related uses, or some kind of social or ritual activity, but left the matter open. What they did emphasise was that the regular geometry, the deliberate movement of material, and the intentionally heated zones indicate a level of social organisation more complex than many researchers had previously associated with Neanderthals of this age. That is a restrained but significant conclusion. The cave does not tell us the whole story. It tells us enough to make older assumptions look insufficient. Deep underground, long before modern humans reached Europe, a group organised labour, light and material to create something structured in the dark. There is a quiet irony here as well. Modern people are often tempted to admire only what looks immediately familiar to us. Straight walls, regular corners, obvious engineering, the visual language of things we would ourselves call buildings. Bruniquel does not flatter that preference. Its rings are low and mineral and cave-borne. They do not resemble a house, a temple, or a fort in the later historical sense. They ask us to recognise construction before architecture becomes comfortable. They ask us to see organisation in a medium that is rough, damp, and unfamiliar. In that way, the rings are not only archaeological objects, they are a test of our categories. If hundreds of stalagmite fragments are broken, sorted, carried, stacked, ringed and heated in a deep chamber, how much more evidence do we require before we admit we are looking at something built? It is also worth noticing what is absent. Bruniquel is not full of the usual parade of artefacts one might expect from a well-used habitation site. No rich scatter of tools lies around to narrate every action. No convenient inscription explains the event. No neat set of domestic leftovers settles the question. The structures dominate because they are the clearest expression of what happened there. They stand almost alone, which in some ways makes them stranger. It is as though the cave preserved the act but not the explanation. The result is that the rings seem to wait, not only in the literal dark where they stood for more than 170,000 years, but in a conceptual dark as well. We can see what was done far more clearly than we can say why. And perhaps that is exactly why the site holds the imagination so firmly. A solved mystery is satisfying. An unsolved act of obvious intention is harder to forget. So the rings at Bruniquel do not merely decorate the story. They are the point where the entire cave changes from geological space into social space. Before them, one can speak about limestone, darkness, access, and the practical difficulty of moving underground. With them, one must begin speaking about decisions shared among people. Someone judged certain stalagmites suitable. Someone broke them. Someone placed them in relation to other pieces. Someone maintained fire nearby. Someone returned often enough or stayed long enough for these traces to cohere into a site. The structures are the visible remains of thought becoming arrangement. And once that much is granted, another question rises naturally and does not go away. If the rings were waiting in the dark for all those millennia, then long before we ever arrived to puzzle over them, someone else had already been there, moving through the chamber as if it belonged for a while to their own world. Once the rings are in view, the next realization comes quietly, but it changes the whole story. These were not waiting for us in the dark in some general anonymous way. They were waiting because long before any modern archaeologist, caver or historian arrived to describe them, somebody else had already made the journey inward. Somebody else had crossed the threshold, entered the dark part of the cave, carried light far from the entrance, and treated that chamber as a place where work could be done. The uranium-series dating published in Nature placed the structures at about 176,500 years old, with an uncertainty of about plus or minus 2,100 years, and that age matters because in southwestern Europe at that time the only known humans were Neanderthals. The cave itself had later been sealed off for tens of thousands of years, preserving what they left behind until its modern rediscovery in 1990. That is the point where the old phrase "long before us" needs a little care. In the everyday sense, yes, this happened long before us. Long before modern civilization, long before writing, long before villages, fields, churches, roads, and all the other things that make history feel familiar. But not before humanity in the broader family sense. Neanderthals were not monsters, not cave cartoons with clubs and poor posture, not half-finished people waiting for a better species to arrive and sort things out. They were ancient human relatives, the only known human inhabitants of Europe at the time Bruniquel was used, and the people most researchers identify as the builders of the cave structures. That is what makes the site so powerful. It does not tell us that someone came here in some vague, mythic sense. It tells us that a real group of Neanderthals did. For a very long time, Neanderthals suffered from dreadful public relations. They were often cast as the sturdy but limited cousins in the human story, good in a cold snap perhaps, but not quite equal to the kind of planning, imagination, and coordination we like to reserve for ourselves. Even where scientists had long since become more cautious than that, the stereotype remained stubborn. Bruniquel is one of those sites that makes the stereotype look thin and a little embarrassing. The LSCE summary of the original research states plainly that the regular geometry of the circles, the arrangement of broken stalagmites, and the traces of fire demonstrate an anthropogenic origin, and that the Neanderthal group responsible likely had a level of social organisation more complex than previously thought for this hominin. Chris Stringer, commenting on the discovery, said it provided clear evidence of Neanderthal planning and construction abilities in deep caves, where artificial lighting would have been essential. That phrase, social organisation, can sound a little dry, so it helps to translate it into ordinary terms. It means this did not happen through random enthusiasm. Someone had to know the route. Someone had to carry light or fuel or both. Someone had to choose which stalagmites to break and move. Someone had to understand, at least roughly, what shape was being made. Perhaps one person gave direction. Perhaps several did. Perhaps the task unfolded over more than one visit. The researchers and later commentators have been careful here, because the cave does not tell us how many people were involved, or whether the structures were built in a single event or over several, but the scale of the activity, involving roughly 400 stalagmite pieces with a total length of about 112 metres and a mass around 2.2 tonnes, makes solitary improvisation a rather poor fit. Even if one tried to picture a single Neanderthal marching into the dark with a private passion for cave design, the material itself objects. This looks collective, and that is perhaps the simplest way to put it. Long before us, a group came here. Not just a body, not just a footprint, not just a brief visit to shelter from weather. A group because caves that dark and work that deliberate tend to imply more than one person, more than one role, more than one decision made in sequence. In modern life, we're surrounded by invisible cooperation, and so we barely notice it. One person cooks, another brings wood, another builds, another remembers the way back, another watches the children, another notices when the flame is failing. None of that needs a meeting agenda to counter social structure. It only needs a shared task. Bruniquel, stripped of all modern language, still preserves the bones of such a task. People went in, material moved, form appeared, fire was used, That's enough to tell us there was coordination, even if the finer details are gone. It is also worth noticing how early this is. Bruniquel is not merely interesting because Neanderthals built something. It is interesting because they built something this deep underground, roughly 176,500 years ago. National Geographic's summary of the discovery notes that the site predates the arrival of Homo sapiens in Europe by more than 100,000 years. In other words, whatever comfort some people once took in assigning deep planning, built space, or unusual cave use mainly to modern humans arriving later in Europe, Bruniquel rather disrupts that comfort. The cave does not wait politely for our preferred timeline, it presents a different one. There were Neanderthals in Europe long before modern humans arrived there, and at Bruniquel they were doing something that still strikes us as unexpected. Now, unexpected does not mean impossible. This is an important distinction. One of the reasons discoveries like Bruniquel feel dramatic is that they collide with old assumptions, not with the evidence of what Neanderthals were generally capable of. Even before this cave, researchers already knew Neanderthals were intelligent, adaptable, big-brained humans who controlled fire and survived for a very long time in demanding environments. They later coexisted with modern humans and sometimes interbred with them. The question was never whether they were dull. It was how far their planning, abstraction, and social complexity extended, and how often such behaviours left traces that could survive. Bruniquel does not create Neanderthal intelligence out of nowhere. What it does is give that intelligence a particularly stubborn and physical form in a place where almost no one expected to find it. There is a difference, after all, between saying a species was capable of skill and seeing the result of that skill sitting on a cave floor more than 300 metres from the entrance. One is a general claim, the other is a confrontation with evidence. That confrontation matters because material traces discipline the imagination. We cannot know what the builders called themselves, what voices sounded like in that chamber, who was older, who was younger, who hesitated, who took the lead, who carried the first flame inward. Those things are beyond recovery. But we do know that they reached the dark part of the cave and altered it. The 2026 reconstruction of the cave entrance strengthens this picture by suggesting that the paleo cave entrance was less than 2 meters high and that the space behind it would have become dark rapidly. The same study states that Bruniquel contains the oldest evidence of deep cave use by early Homo neanderthalensis, and that the site demonstrates their ability to investigate the subterranean environment in a structured way. So when we say someone came here, that is not narrative decoration. It is the plain meaning of the site. And then there is the question of what came here would have felt like to them. We cannot answer that directly, of course, but we can avoid making it too vague. These were people with bodies in a hard physical world. They would have felt the change in temperature. They would have felt the awkwardness of the entrance and the narrowing of light behind them. They would have had to manage footing, fuel, smoke and distance. They would have known, at least once the way was learned, where the chamber lay and how far it was. That practical familiarity matters. It turns Neanderthals from symbols into people again. Not symbols of modernity. Not symbols of lost intelligence. Just people in the older, deeper sense. A group moving through an environment that required memory, care, and some confidence in one another. That may sound less grand than saying they possessed behavioural modernity, but in some ways it is more meaningful. A phrase can be debated for decades. A shared journey into cave darkness cannot happen without trust doing at least some of the work. There is another reason this section of the story matters, and it has to do with time. At 176,500 years ago, none of the builders knew they were early by our standards. None of them knew they would become evidence in a debate about cognition and human difference. They were not trying to prove Neanderthals could do complex things. They were simply doing something they had reason to do. That is a useful corrective. Archaeological sites often become stages on which we project our own arguments. Bruniquel can easily become a moral lesson about underestimating others, or a symbol of human continuity, or a piece in the larger puzzle of what makes us human. It can bear all that to a point. But before it becomes a lesson, It was an event. A group entered a cave and built something there because to them, that action made sense in the world they inhabited. That is why I think the most important word in this part of the story is not Neanderthal, although that word matters greatly. It is someone, not because we do not know who they were, but because the word keeps them close to experience. Someone bent to lift those stalagmite pieces. Someone judged which ones were useful. Someone saw the ring taking shape. Someone noticed where the fire should be. Someone had enough sense of the place to know how to get back out. Someone came here before us and in doing so made the cave into a social place rather than a merely geological one. The farther back in time we go, the easier it is to flatten people into categories. Someone resists that flattening. Someone reminds us that behind every structure lies a body, a decision, a set of hands, a moment of effort, and still, for all that, caution is needed. There is much we do not know. National Geographic, in reporting the discovery, quoted researchers emphasizing that the find is unusual and that it remains uncertain how many people were involved, whether the structures were made in one event or several, and what the purpose of the activity was. That uncertainty is real and should stay in the story. It is part of what keeps Bruniquel honest. We do not need to inflate the evidence to make it impressive. It is already impressive. We do not need to pretend the cave has yielded a full social portrait. It has not. What it has yielded is something more stubborn, a built trace that cannot be explained away without doing violence to the facts. That is often how the past corrects us. Not by speaking clearly, but by leaving behind something inconveniently solid. What follows from that is not a grand proclamation that Neanderthals were just like us in every respect. History is not improved by simply replacing one caricature with another. Neanderthals were Neanderthals. Their lives, bodies, environments, and histories were their own. The better correction is smaller and more durable. They were capable of far more planning, coordination, and environmental control than older stereotypes allowed, and Bruniquel is one of the clearest pieces of evidence for that. Deep cave use requiring artificial lighting, deliberate construction from hundreds of broken stalagmites, and intentionally heated zones point to organised activity by people who understood both the cave and one another well enough to act together inside it. So when we picture the chamber now, we should no longer picture it as merely empty darkness waiting for a discovery team. We should picture it as a place that had already been entered with intent by people who knew enough to come this far and do more than pass through. Long before the villages above, long before the language we now use to classify prehistory, long before the first written story, someone had already crossed that ground. And because they came here, the next question becomes practical in the most immediate way. If a group of Neanderthals really did move deep into a cave that lost daylight almost at once, and if they worked there long enough to build and heat these structures, then the chamber would not only have been occupied by bodies and stone, it would have been occupied by light itself, managed flame by flame against the rock. And that changes everything, because once fire enters the picture, the chamber stops being merely a destination and becomes a working place. Darkness on its own is an obstacle. Darkness with controlled fire becomes something else, a problem not solved exactly, but held at bay long enough for people to move, see, gather, choose, place, and remain. That is one of the quiet but profound things Bruniquel tells us. Whoever came here did not simply brave the dark in some vague heroic sense. They managed it. They did so well enough that deep inside the cave, on and around the ring structures, the stone itself still bears traces of heat. The published descriptions note several traces of fire associated with the constructions, including speleofacts that were reddened, blackened, or fractured by heat, as well as burnt organic material including bone. In other words, the chamber was not only reached by firelight, it was worked in firelight, and the evidence of that work remained on the cave floor for roughly 176,500 years. It helps to slow down over that because modern life makes light feel cheap. We hardly notice how often we summon it. A switch, a screen, a flashlight app, a lamp beside the bed. the reassuring glow of a hallway at 2 a.m. that saves us from stubbing a toe and losing faith in civilization. But in Bruniquel, deep beyond daylight, light was not background. It was labour, it was preparation, it was fuel carried inward and kept alive under conditions where failure would matter at once. The later reconstruction of the cave entrance suggests that the Paleo cave opening was less than 2 meters high, and that darkness would have begun almost immediately behind it. The structures themselves lay 336 meters from the entrance. That means the people who came here were not extending a short visit in twilight. They were operating in a part of the cave where the sun was irrelevant, and artificial light was the only thing standing between orientation and blindness. Once you picture that correctly, the chamber changes character. It is no longer just an archaeological site viewed under modern illumination in photographs or diagrams. It becomes an ancient environment defined by moving pools of light. Fire does not reveal a cave cleanly. It flickers, throws shadows, exaggerates edges, and makes mineral surfaces seem to shift as you look at them. The walls are not evenly lit. The floor is not reliably visible beyond a certain radius. A flame or cluster of flames would have created islands of certainty floating in a great deal of uncertainty. That matters because building under those conditions is not the same thing as building under the open sky. Every task becomes slower. Distances shrink to what the light can hold. A placed stone has to be seen in relation to the others by means of wavering brightness. A person carrying fuel and a person arranging material become part of the same system. Fire, then, is not just one more detail at Bruniquel. It is the enabling technology without which the rest of the scene does not happen at all. The 2016 research team explicitly treated the cave as evidence for the appropriation of a deep-cast space, including lighting by a pre-modern human species. The physical traces of that lighting are among the most intimate things the cave preserves. According to the descriptions of the structures, 57 of the speleofact show reddening and 66 show blackening, and several pieces were fractured by heat. Burnt matter, including bone fragments, was found near the structures as well. National Geographic's summary of the site noted that the heated zones are located on the speleothems themselves, with a concentration of charred material on the ground near one of the constructions. These are not the sort of traces one gets from a single accidental flare-up that happened to lick a few stones on the way out. They suggest repeated or deliberate use of fire in relation to the structures, as though the rings and the flame belong to one behavioural setting. Even if we remain cautious about function, the relationship between stone and heat is difficult to dismiss. The chamber was arranged, and then within that arrangement people made and used fire. That last point is especially important because fire underground is not casual. On the surface, a hearth can serve many ordinary purposes at once: warmth, cooking, light, social gathering, keeping predators uneasy, helping a long evening become survivable. In a cave, especially a deep one, fire has some of those same functions but under tighter constraints. Smoke matters more, ventilation matters more, fuel matters more, where you put the flame matters more, because the flame is doing more work. It is not just a source of comfort, it is the thing that allows the chamber to remain a place rather than collapse back into unusable darkness. That means anyone using fire at Bruniquel had to understand, at least practically, how to manage it in that environment. The existence of intentionally heated zones deep in the cave is therefore not just evidence that Neanderthals knew fire, which we already had good reasons to think. It is evidence that they could deploy fire as part of a structured underground activity. The more one thinks about that, the less primitive it sounds, and the more quietly sophisticated it becomes. There is also something revealing in the fact that the traces of heat appear on the structures themselves. If the fire had been entirely separate from the rings, one might be more tempted to think in terms of unrelated episodes, people simply stopping in the chamber at different times and using the same space for different reasons. But where the stone is blackened or reddened on the constructions, the association becomes tighter. The structures are not just near the action, they are implicated in it. Some commentators at the time of the discovery suggested the possibility that fire was embedded within or closely associated with the structures to illuminate the chamber, and even the cautious scientific summaries agree that the heated areas form part of the anthropogenic pattern. That still does not tell us whether the rings were practical features, markers, supports, gathering spaces, or something more difficult to classify. But it does tell us that they were active in the presence of flame. They were not merely arranged and left in symbolic silence. They belong to a place where stone and fire met. And once that is granted, a more human picture begins to emerge, though it must be kept disciplined. We do not know exactly what fuel they brought in. We do not know how many people carried it. We do not know whether the fires burned long or only intermittently. We do not know whether the chamber glowed with several small points of light or one central blaze attended with care. The cave does not yield that level of detail, but it does allow a few careful inferences. Someone had to plan for light before entering. Someone had to maintain flame after entering. Someone had to choose where that fire would sit in relation to the built forms. Someone had to accept smoke, heat, and limited visibility as part of the task. Those are all ordinary practical inferences from the evidence itself, and together they have a surprisingly strong effect. They make the site feel less like an abstract proof of cognition, and more like a scene of work. Not industrial work, not modern work, but the older and more intimate kind, where a small group shares a difficult environment and keeps a process going by constant attention. There is a tendency in discussions of prehistory to separate technical skill from social meaning, as though some things count as practical and others count as symbolic, and never the two shall meet. Fire in caves is a good reminder that ancient life was rarely so neatly sorted. To keep a fire burning underground requires knowledge. To gather around it requires social coordination. To position it within a built space may carry practical logic, but it may also shape the experience of the place itself. Light changes how a structure is perceived. A ring seen in firelight is not only visible, it becomes dramatic in a way daylight architecture is not. The edges glow, the inner space darkens and brightens by turns, the low walls cast small moving shadows, and the cave beyond remains hidden. It would be unwise to declare that this must have been ritual, because archaeology earns nothing by pretending certainty where certainty does not exist. Yet it would be equally unwise to imagine that such a setting had no experiential force for the people inside it. Practical action and felt significance are not enemies. In deep caves, they are often the same event looked at from two sides. This is one reason Bruniquel has attracted so much attention beyond the bare headline that Neanderthals built something underground. The finding does not merely add fire to a list of things they could do, it suggests they could use fire as part of organised spatial behaviour in a difficult environment. Chris Stringer's comment on the discovery emphasised that the site provides clear evidence of Neanderthal planning and construction abilities in deep caves, where artificial lighting would have been essential. That phrasing matters. Essential is the key word. Fire here is not optional decoration. It is one of the conditions of the site's very existence. The rings only become possible if a group can solve the problem of deep cave lighting well enough to work by it. Once seen that way, the heat-marked speleofacts are not just damaged mineral pieces. They are evidence that this solution was real. The cave also makes one think differently about time, not in the grand cosmic sense, but in the practical rhythm of an underground visit. Above ground, evening comes gradually. Even in bad weather, the world usually fades by degrees. Underground, light exists only while it is fed. That means the human experience of time inside the chamber would have been tied directly to the management of flame. Fuel consumed itself visibly. Shadow shifted with every adjustment. A fire dying down was not just the end of warmth, it was the narrowing of the world. That fact alone may have shaped how people behaved in the chamber. Tasks would need sequencing. Materials would need arranging while visibility remained good enough. Return would have to be timed. If more than one fire source was used, then attention would be divided among them. In other words, fire would not simply illuminate the work, it would structure the tempo of the work. This may be one reason the site feels so vivid even though so little can be said with certainty. The moment you imagine flame underground, all action becomes contingent, embodied, immediate. The chamber ceases to be a diagram and becomes a lived setting again. There is also the question of warmth, though here one should be careful. We do not know that the fires at Bruniquel were used mainly for heat, nor do we know the exact climatic conditions of every moment of occupation. But the site dates to marine isotope stage 6, a generally cold period, and the cave environment itself would have been cool and stable in a way that surface people know from caves even now. Fire, then, may have offered warmth as well as light, but warmth in such a place would have been local and partial. A small cluster around a flame, hands near heat, faces lit and warmed while the chamber beyond remained damp, still and old. There is something grounding in that image because it reminds us that whatever larger significance the rings had, the people using them were not abstract intellects performing for science. They were bodies dealing with temperature, visibility and material under pressure of circumstance. The most extraordinary archaeological sites often remain at some level scenes of ordinary physical needs being managed in unusual settings. One of the quieter pleasures of Bruniquel is that it resists sensationalism while still deserving wonder. Firelight on stone sounds dramatic, and rightly so, but the evidence itself is modest and stubborn rather than theatrical. Blackened calcite, reddened surfaces, fracture from heat, burnt bone. These are not extravagant traces. They are the sort of traces fire leaves when it is really used. And that is exactly why they are persuasive. A deep chamber does not need a roaring inferno to become significant. A few managed flames in the right place, associated with structures built from hundreds of broken stalagmites, are enough to shift the whole interpretation of the cave. The researchers did not need to claim spectacular pyrotechnics. The cave preserved something better, the practical residue of flame in a context where flame should not have been possible without planning. There is too a lovely awkwardness in how this evidence undercuts an old habit of mind. We sometimes imagine deep prehistory as dim not only in literal light but in intelligence, as though the farther back we go the less intention there could possibly be. Bruniquel reverses that very neatly. The deeper we go into the cave, the more intention appears, not less. The outer world is left behind, and in the dark there emerges construction, calibrated pieces, annular forms, heated areas, traces of organised action. That reversal is hard to ignore. The chamber is dark, but the evidence is not dim at all. If anything, it is embarrassingly clear on one point. Somebody knew how to make a place there with fire. And once that is acknowledged, the next question comes forward almost at once. Knowing that flame touched the structures is one thing. Knowing when that happened, and how anyone could possibly assign an age so immense to blackened stone and cave-built rings is another matter altogether, and it turns out the cave had been keeping an answer to that as carefully as it kept the fire traces themselves. This is the point in the story where the cave stops asking only for imagination and starts asking for trust. It is one thing to stand in the chamber, at least in the mind, and picture those low rings of broken stalagmites waiting in the dark. It is another thing entirely to believe that they are really as old as the claim suggests. 100 years old would already be interesting. 1,000 would be impressive. 10,000 would be enough to make most people pause. But Bruniquel does not ask for any of those smaller acts of belief. It asks us to accept an age of about 176,500 years. And whenever archaeology makes a claim that large, the right response is not breathless agreement, but a very calm and slightly stubborn question. How do you know? As it happens, the scientists had to ask the same thing, because the cave did not come with a helpful sign saying, "Built in the middle of marine isotope stage 6, yours sincerely, the Neanderthals." The age had to be worked out indirectly from the materials the cave itself provided. That is often how deep prehistory works. The best answers are rarely written in obvious forms. More often they are trapped in chemistry, buried in mineral growth, or layered in ways that require someone patient enough to ask the right question of stone. In Bruniquel, the key was not simply the broken stalagmites arranged into rings. It was the fact that after those stalagmites had been broken, moved and placed, new calcite grew over parts of the structures and over a burnt bone associated with them. That later regrowth turned out to be exactly the sort of thing a geochronologist would like to meet in a cave. There had been an earlier clue, but it was only a clue. During the first investigations in the early 1990s, a burnt bone from the cave was dated using radiocarbon and came back as older than 47,600 years. That already told researchers the site was ancient, but not ancient enough in a useful way. Older than is helpful when one is trying to rule out recent disturbance, but it is not the same as a real age. It is rather like asking someone how old a tree is and being told only that it is definitely older than your grandparents. True, perhaps, but not precise enough to settle the matter. So for a long time Bruniquel remained intriguing but unresolved. The cave had yielded something strange, and a burnt bone had hinted at great antiquity, yet the structures themselves still sat in a kind of chronological fog. What changed was the decision to date the calcite directly with uranium-series dating, often called uranium-thorium or youth dating. The basic idea is simple enough to explain without requiring anyone to put on a lab coat. When calcite forms in caves, it contains a little uranium but essentially no thorium. Over time, the uranium decays into thorium at a known rate. By measuring how much uranium remains and how much thorium has formed, researchers can calculate how long it has been since that calcite was deposited. Science Daily's summary of the Bruniquel work explains it neatly. Uranium is present when the stalagmite forms, and as time passes it breaks down into thorium, so the ratio between the two becomes a clock. It is a particularly useful clock for cave deposits because caves are very good at making calcite slowly, and with no concern whatsoever for our deadlines. But the real cleverness at Bruniquel was not merely using youth dating. It was realising exactly which parts of the cave formations needed to be sampled in order to bracket the age of construction from both sides. The researchers dated the tops of stalagmites that had been used as building elements, because those tops tell you the latest possible time the original stalagmites were still growing before people broke them off. In other words, they provide a maximum age for the construction. Then they dated the bases of calcite regrowth that formed on top of the structures after they had been built. Those regrowths provide a minimum age because they can only begin after the human arrangement is already there. The logic is very elegant. If the stalagmite stopped growing before it was used, a new calcite started growing again only after the structure existed. Then the act of construction must fall between those two dates. It is not a single guess. It is a bracket, and a very strong one. That is what makes the dating at Bruniquel so persuasive. The team did not rely on one lonely sample and hope for the best. According to the Nature paper, they obtained 18 multi-collector ICP-MS uranium-series ages from calcite cores extracted from the stalagmites, and they dated 4 additional samples as well, one from flowstone pavement inside the main annular structure, and 3 from the calcite layer that formed on the burnt bone inside one of the accumulation structures. That kind of replication matters, because extraordinary claims are always stronger when several independent samples converge on the same time window, rather than one dramatic result sitting by itself and trying not to look nervous. The overlap they found is exactly the sort of thing scientists like. From the regrowths that covered the structures, the 2 oldest ages fell in the same window, 177.9 plus or minus 3.7 thousand years, and 175.2 plus or minus 0.8 thousand years. Those ages overlap with the age of the youngest dated stalagmite used in the structure, which came out at 177.1 plus or minus 1.5 thousand years. In plain language, the latest growth of the original building material and the earliest regrowth sealing the structures agree tightly enough that the construction event can be placed between them. The paper states that the structures were built between 175.2 plus or minus 0.8 thousand years and 177.1 plus or minus 1.5 thousand years, and summarises that as a reliable replicated age of 176.5 plus or minus 2.1 thousand years. That is not hand-waving. That is a remarkably tidy bracket for something so old. It is also worth pausing over the burnt bone because it provides a second line of reassurance. The largest burnt fragment, a 6.7 centimetre bone from either a bear or a large herbivore, lay within one of the accumulation structures and was covered by a 6mm calcite layer. That calcite was itself dated, yielding an age of 180.9 plus or minus 20.3 thousand years, which gives a minimum age for the bone and adds further evidence that human activity in the cave belongs to this deep time horizon. Another black fragment was trapped between calcite regrowth and the structure itself, again linking burning calcite formation and the structures into one chronological picture rather than several unrelated episodes. So the age estimate does not rest only on the stones. It is reinforced by the thermal traces associated with them. There is a subtle but important reason all this matters so much. Dating a cave site is often difficult precisely because caves keep changing. Water drips, calcite accumulates, floors crust over, sediment shifts, and the very processes that preserve a site can also hide or complicate it. At Bruniquel, the cave's thick calcite crust had coated the structures, sealing them in place and concealing the original floor. That prevented researchers from simply finding the sort of open occupation layer one might dream of in a perfect world. But that same mineral cover became the solution, because it recorded a before and after. The stalagmites had their own geological lives before humans broke them. The regrowth had its own geological life after humans placed them. The dating method could read both. So the cave, in a rather satisfying turn, did not merely hide the evidence, it also kept the clock. This is why the Bruniquel date has held up so well. It is not just old. Many things are old. It is well dated in a way that prehistorians find especially compelling. The Nature paper itself calls these among the oldest known well-dated constructions made by humans, and the LSCE summary emphasises that the age is both reliable and replicated. That phrase, well dated, may not sound glamorous, but in archaeology it is gold. A spectacular claim without strong chronology remains a fascinating rumour. A spectacular claim with multiple consistent uranium-series dates attached to specific mineral relationships becomes much harder to dismiss. Bruniquel moved from the first category to the second. That is why it changed the conversation. Then, as if the cave had not already been obliging enough, a later study added another layer of confirmation from a different direction. In 2026, researchers published a detailed study of the evolution of the cave entrance. Using stratigraphic surveys, 3D mapping, electrical resistivity tomography, and U-series dating, they reconstructed how the entrance changed over time and concluded that the cave closed before 142.9 plus or minus 1.3 thousand years ago, before the last interglacial. That result matters because it independently confirms that the structures and associated traces on the cave floor must predate the final closure of the entrance. It does not replace the original 176.5 thousand year age. Rather, it supports it from the side by showing that the cave was already sealed long before any younger occupation could explain the structures. In science, this kind of independent convergence is deeply reassuring. The 2026 study also tightened another point that helps the chronology make practical sense. Its virtual reconstruction suggests that at the beginning of marine isotope stage 6, the paleo cave entrance was less than 2 meters high, and that the space behind it became dark rapidly. So the dating result is not floating free of the cave's physical reality. It fits a coherent picture: a small entrance, rapid loss of daylight, deep occupation by Neanderthals, structures in the dark part of the cave, later natural closure, and long-term preservation until rediscovery. Each piece supports the others. That kind of fit between dating, geology and archaeology is one of the quiet pleasures of a good site. Nothing is ever perfectly simple, but the story begins to hold together in a way that feels earned. One can almost think of the scientist's task here as listening for the sequence hidden in the mineral layers. First, stalagmites grow naturally from the cave floor. Then some of them are broken and arranged by people. Then burnt material is deposited in connection with that activity. Then calcite begins growing again over structures and bone. Then, later still, the entrance closes and the whole chamber is effectively sealed off. Finally, very much later, modern researchers reopen the cave and begin reading the mineral record backward. That sequence matters because dating methods are not magic. They do not spit out truth from nowhere. They work because the physical order of events is understandable. If the order were chaotic, the chemistry would be far harder to interpret. At Bruniquel, the sequence is surprisingly readable. The builders unknowingly left the kind of geological sandwich scientists adore. There is also something rather humbling in the fact that the age of one of the most surprising prehistoric structures in Europe was worked out not by the structure's apparent style, not by typology, not by artistic comparison, but by cave calcite behaving exactly as cave calcite does. Archaeology sometimes advances through great conceptual revolutions, but just as often it advances because minerals, isotopes, and patient measurements refuse to be dramatic. Uranium decays, thorium accumulates, regrowth forms, samples are taken, uncertainties are calculated, graphs are drawn, and then, quietly, a date appears so old that it forces everyone to reconsider what Neanderthals were doing in Europe 140,000 years before modern humans arrived there. It is hard not to admire the contrast, a huge shift in human prehistory, delivered by the calm honesty of chemistry. Perhaps the most satisfying part of the whole dating story is that it respects doubt instead of trying to crush it. A weaker study might have rushed to the most dramatic single result and wrapped the matter in certainty. Bruniquel did the opposite. Maximum ages from the broken stalagmite tips, minimum ages from regrowth sealing the structures, additional dating of flowstone inside the main ring, additional dating of calcite covering burnt bone, later confirmation from the cave entrance study. All of this creates not a single line of evidence but a web of evidence. So when we say the structures are around 176,500 years old, that number is not a slogan. It is the middle of a carefully constrained interval, supported by multiple measurements, and later reinforced by the cave's geomorphological history. That is why the claim has weight. It has survived contact with skepticism, because it was built to do so, and once that age is accepted, the whole chamber changes again. The rings are no longer merely odd underground constructions, they become a very early act. Suddenly every broken stalagmite, every heated patch, every low annular wall is pushed back into a period when Europe belonged only to Neanderthals. The date does not just make the site older, it changes who could have made it and what that implies about them. This is the moment when Bruniquel stops being only a cave mystery and becomes a challenge to the old lazy version of Neanderthal history. Because if the chemistry is right, and it appears very much to be, then the builders were not recent humans doing something almost understandable to us. They were much earlier people operating with enough knowledge, coordination, and confidence to make a place deep in the dark long before our own species entered that landscape. That realization leads very naturally to the next question, because once the age is known, the builders step out of the shadows a little more clearly, and we are left to ask what they must already have understood before the first stalagmite was ever moved. By this point, the cave has already told us quite a lot without using a single word. It has told us that someone entered the dark part of the chamber, that someone carried light deep underground, that someone selected and broke stalagmites, arranged them into annular constructions, and used fire in association with those constructions. It has also told us, through uranium-series dating, that all of this happened around 176,500 years ago, in a period when the only known humans in that part of Europe were Neanderthals. Once those things are in place, the question shifts quite naturally. Not who they were, at least not in the broad sense. We have a strong answer to that. The question becomes what they must already have known before the work in Bruniquel could even begin. And that is where the cave becomes especially revealing, because construction leaves behind more than material. It leaves behind the outline of skill. At the very least, the builders already knew the cave. That may sound obvious, but it is not a small point. Bruniquel was not a shallow shelter where one could remain under the guidance of daylight. The structures lie 336 metres from the entrance, and the later reconstruction of the Paleo cave entrance suggests that the opening was less than 2 metres high and that darkness would have begun quickly behind it. So before a single stalagmite was moved, someone had to know that the chamber existed, how to reach it, how long the approach took, and how to leave again. This is not romantic mystery. It is root knowledge, the practical sort that only comes from direct experience repetition or careful shared memory. A deep cave cannot be used in a structured way by people who are merely improvising one nervous step at a time. That root knowledge implies something else as well. It implies familiarity good enough to make the cave usable, rather than merely survivable. We often underestimate how much intelligence is hidden in that distinction. To survive a place once may require luck, caution, and a strong preference for not falling over. To use a place repeatedly requires a more settled understanding. You need to know where the footing worsens, where the ceiling drops, how air moves, where the chamber opens, how darkness changes your sense of distance, and how much fuel you're likely to need if you mean to do more than enter and retreat. The 2026 entrance study explicitly argues that Bruniquel preserves the oldest evidence of deep cave use by early Homo neanderthalensis, and that the site demonstrates their ability to investigate the subterranean environment in a structured way. That phrase is useful because structured is exactly the right word. They were not merely daring, they were organised. They also already knew how to manage fire in a place where fire was not optional. The structures stand far beyond the reach of daylight, and the original Nature paper treats the site as evidence for the appropriation of deep karst space, including lighting by a pre-modern human species. That means fire at Bruniquel was not just warmth or atmosphere, it was part of the infrastructure of the activity. The chamber could only become a workplace, or gathering place, or whatever exact kind of place it was, if someone understood how to carry flame inward, keep it alive, place it safely enough, and use it long enough to complete a task. The traces on the site support that reading. Many spieler facts were reddened or blackened by heat, and charred material, including burnt bone, was found in association with the constructions. Fire was not a passing visitor. It was one of the operating conditions of the site. That in turn suggests they already knew something about fuel, even if the cave does not tell us exactly how fuel was carried or stored. It is one thing to control fire near a cave mouth, where escape, air and daylight remain close at hand. It is another to depend on it in an enclosed underground setting where the flame must do several jobs at once. It must illuminate the floor, the walls, and the other people present. It must make the structures visible enough to work on them. It may also provide warmth, orientation, and a sense of spatial control in a place that otherwise offers very little of that. So one thing the builders must already have known is that light is a resource. It runs out. It must be planned for. It can fail. And underground, if it fails, the consequences are immediate. Bruniquel does not show us abstract intelligence. It shows us competence under conditions where competence mattered. Then there is the matter of material. The builders did not gather random rubble from a floor and happen upon a ring by good fortune. The constructions are made from around 400 broken stalagmite pieces, with a combined length of about 112 metres and an estimated mass of roughly 2.2 tonnes. The pieces were not all the same length, of course, but they were sufficiently regular that the researchers described them as partially calibrated. The average lengths used in the major constructions fall into a fairly narrow range, and some pieces were laid in one layer, others in 2, 3, or 4 superimposed layers. Some smaller fragments seem to have been used as wedges or supports, and larger pieces were set against the sides of the annular forms as reinforcement. That means the builders already knew which parts of the cave's mineral growth were workable, what size pieces were useful, and how those pieces would sit against one another once placed. That is not a decorative instinct. It is technical judgment. To put that more plainly, they understood that material has behaviour. A stalagmite segment too long is awkward to move in place. One too short may not contribute usefully to a low wall or ring. A piece laid one way may hold. Laid another way, it may roll, slip, or leave the line unstable. Support elements matter. Layering matters. Orientation matters. We're not talking about advanced engineering in the later historical sense, but we're very clearly talking about embodied knowledge of what stone can do. That may have been learned elsewhere before Bruniquel, perhaps in the ordinary handling of rock, bone, wood, and fire in daily life. The cave does not tell us where the knowledge came from. It only tells us that by the time the builders entered the chamber, they already had it. Otherwise, the rings would not have the regularity they do. They also already knew how to break things deliberately. This may seem almost too basic to mention, but it is one of the quiet foundations of the whole site. A stalagmite growing from a cave floor is not a loose object waiting to be picked up and carried wherever history requires. It has to be detached, and detached in a way that produces pieces useful for later placement. The Nature paper notes evidence of removed stalagmites near the structures, which suggests local extraction from the cave environment itself. That means the builders were not simply rearranging what they happened to find lying around. They were transforming the cave's own formations into building components. To do that efficiently enough to create annular forms from hundreds of segments, they must already have understood not just force, but controlled force. Where to strike, how much to strike, what fracture would give them something usable rather than useless. Again, the cave preserves the result more clearly than the process, but the process is there in outline. And once material is being extracted and moved, another form of knowledge appears almost automatically. Effort must be worth it. About 2.2 tons of material in total were used in the constructions. That does not mean anyone hauled 2.2 tons in one miserable afternoon while muttering about project timelines, but it does mean the overall labour was significant. So the builders must already have known, collectively or intuitively, that the chamber was a place worth investing labour in. This may have been because the site served some practical function we still do not recognise. It may have been because the location itself mattered to them. It may have involved repeated visits that turned the chamber into a known destination. We do not know, but we can say this much. Labour on this scale implies purpose held firmly enough that people were willing to spend time, strength, and light on it. One does not accidentally commit to 2 tons of underground rearrangement. That brings us to what they must already have known about one another. This is perhaps the most interesting part because Bruniquel is not just a lesson in technical ability, it is a lesson in social ability. The original paper concludes that the Neanderthal group responsible for the constructions had a level of social organisation more complex than previously thought for the species. That wording is careful, and it should remain careful. The cave does not tell us whether there was a leader, whether the work was taught formally, or whether it was tied to ritual, refuge, or some entirely practical purpose. But it does suggest shared action. Someone had to remember the route. Someone had to tend flame. Someone had to move material. Someone had to recognise when the arrangement matched whatever was intended. Even if roles shifted from person to person, the task still depends on a group acting with enough coordination to keep the chamber usable while the work proceeded. There is an old temptation to talk about this kind of thing in very grand terms, as though every sign of coordinated behaviour must instantly become proof of symbolism, ritual, or mental modernity in the most loaded possible sense. Bruniquel does not require that inflation. What it requires, more simply, is that we accept the builders already knew how to cooperate under demanding conditions. They knew how to share a difficult task. They knew how to operate with a common enough understanding of what the space was for or what the material should become, that individual actions added up to a coherent result. If that sounds modest, it should not. Shared intentionality of even a practical kind is one of the deepest building blocks of social life. The cave may not prove philosophy. It proves teamwork in the dark, which is in some ways more persuasive. They also seem to have known how to create bounded space. This is easy to overlook because rings are so visually simple. But simplicity can hide sophistication. An annular structure is not just a pile. It defines an inside and an outside. It marks a boundary, however low and permeable. The largest Bruniquel structure encloses space, and two of the smaller accumulations lie inside it while two lie outside. That does not tell us precisely what those distinctions meant, but it does tell us that the builders were not merely stacking material. They were organising space. They were making a place within a place. In a deep cave where the environment is otherwise one continuous field of stone and dark that matters, it means the chamber was being given internal order. An internal order is one of the clearest ways human minds leave themselves visible. The builders must also have known something about repetition. This is a slightly quieter form of intelligence, but it runs all through the site. Hundreds of pieces broken to workable lengths. The same kinds of actions repeated often enough to produce stable annular forms. Fire used in relation to the structures, not merely once in passing, but enough to leave heat traces on many pieces. A single inspired impulse might produce a strange scatter. Repetition produces consistency. Bruniquel suggests the builders could sustain a sequence of actions long enough for structure to emerge. That may have taken one long episode or several shorter ones. The cave does not decide that question for us. But either way, the builders already knew how to continue a task beyond the first act of enthusiasm. They knew how to keep going until something had been made. And then there is perhaps the most difficult knowledge to talk about without drifting into exaggeration. They may have known that place itself can matter. The chamber is deep, dark, enclosed, and disconnected from ordinary daylight life. The structures are not where daily shelter makes obvious sense, and the researchers themselves considered simple habitation an unlikely explanation. That does not prove ritual, and it certainly does not justify inventing a prehistoric drama complete with sacred speeches and meaningful glances in the half-light. But it does mean the builders were willing to treat a non-ordinary location as worth entering and shaping. Whether the reason was technical, social, symbolic, or something more mixed than our categories allow, the choice of place was not trivial. At minimum, they already knew this chamber was not just empty cave. It was a location that warranted organised action. All of this helps explain why Bruniquel changed the conversation about Neanderthals so noticeably. Before the discovery, deep cave use by Neanderthals beyond daylight exposure, requiring artificial lighting and associated with constructions, was unknown. The site therefore did not just add one more oddity to the record. It widened the behavioural landscape. It suggested that by around 176,500 years ago, some Neanderthals already possessed a practical package of knowledge that included underground navigation, fire management in darkness, material selection and calibration, spatial organisation, and cooperative action, substantial enough to produce and maintain built forms. None of those capacities needs to be mystical. Their power lies precisely in how real they are. So when we ask what the builders already knew, the answer is not a single talent or a single revelation. It is a cluster of competencies brought together in one difficult setting. They knew the route, they knew the dark, they knew fire well enough to depend on it underground. They knew how stone breaks and how pieces can be arranged into a stable form. They knew how to share labour and persist with a task. They knew that this chamber, for reasons we still cannot fully recover, was worth the effort. And once that much is accepted, the next step in the story becomes even more vivid, because all of that knowledge only matters if someone actually used it there, in the moving light, with smoke in the air and mineral walls closing in, while the chamber slowly took shape around the first flames. This is where the cave becomes most difficult, because up to now the story has offered us strong footholds. The site exists. The structures are deliberate. They were built from broken stalagmites. They lie 336 meters from the entrance, in a zone that would have gone dark quickly. The age is around 176,500 years. The likely builders were Neanderthals. Those are firm enough statements. But once we ask why anyone would build so deep underground, the footing changes. The original Nature paper asked almost exactly that question itself. What was the function of these structures at such a great distance from the cave entrance? And why are most of the fireplaces found on the structures rather than directly on the cave floor? The authors then did something admirable. They did not pretend to know. They raised several possibilities, including symbolic or ritual behaviour, an unknown domestic use, or simple refuge, and left the matter open for future research. That caution is not a weakness in the Bruniquel story. It is the whole reason the site remains so compelling. Still, not knowing the answer is not the same as knowing nothing. Some explanations fit the evidence better than others. The most immediately tempting one is ordinary habitation, because when people gather, build something and use fire, we are naturally inclined to think of living space. But Bruniquel resists that easy reading. The structures stand deep in the cave, in a dark zone requiring artificial light, and as of recent summaries there is still very little additional evidence of occupation beyond the constructions and the fire traces. The original researchers themselves treated the site as unprecedented because Neanderthal constructions beyond the daylight zone were previously unknown, and they explicitly questioned whether the structures might have had some unknown domestic use, or instead served another role entirely. So a simple version of "this was just a home" does not sit very comfortably with the evidence we have. The distance matters more than it may seem. Caves near their mouths are useful in ordinary practical ways. They provide shelter from wind, rain and temperature swings. They can serve as defensible resting places and as staging grounds for hunting or movement through a landscape. Deep cave interiors are different. Once daylight disappears, the space stops being cheap to use. Light must be carried in and maintained. The route must be remembered. Time underground must be managed against fuel and visibility. The 2026 entrance study reinforces this point by showing that the Paleo entrance was small, under 2 meters high, and that the space behind it would have become dark rapidly. So whatever was drawing people to the chamber, it had to be worth the extra burden of underground logistics. That alone narrows the field a little. Not enough to solve the mystery, but enough to say that Deep Bruniquel was not the simplest option available to Ice Age people looking for somewhere merely to sit out bad weather. And yet, refuge cannot be ruled out. Chris Stringer, commenting on the discovery, suggested that the cave may have provided a temporary refuge from very cold conditions, with the possibility that more evidence of occupation could still lie hidden beneath unexcavated sediments or later calcite crusts. That is a sensible reminder not to become too confident too quickly. Caves preserve unevenly. Bruniquel structures are now coated and partly sealed by calcite, and the chamber has not yielded a rich open living floor of the kind archaeologists might ideally want. So there remains a possibility that the visible structures were part of a more practical use of the space than the surviving evidence currently makes obvious. In other words, not clearly domestic is not the same as certainly not practical. The cave still has room to surprise us. Even so, refuge on its own leaves some awkward questions behind. If a group wanted only a temporary protected spot, why invest labour in breaking, transporting and arranging around 400 stalagmite pieces with a combined length of roughly 112 metres and a total mass of about 2.2 tonnes? Why create annular forms rather than a looser accumulation? Why are the heated zones associated so closely with the structures themselves? The researchers stress that the geometry is irregular, that the stalagmites are partially calibrated, and that the pieces were deliberately moved and placed. Those details make the constructions feel more formal, than one expects from emergency shelter improvised in a difficult setting. A desperate refuge can be messy. Bruniquel is not neat in a modern architectural sense, but it is clearly organised. That organisation is what keeps pulling interpretation away from simple refuge and towards something that had structure in both the physical and social sense. There is then the possibility the original team themselves mentioned most carefully, some kind of unknown domestic or technical use. That may sound vague, but vagueness is honest here. We should resist the modern habit of assuming that every prehistoric built feature must map neatly onto our own categories of house, workshop, shrine, or fort. There may have been practical uses for low annular constructions in a cave environment that are not immediately obvious to us because the broader behavioural context is missing. The Nature paper specifically raised the possibility of unknown domestic use and pointed out the odd fact that most of the fireplaces are on the structures rather than directly on the cave floor. That pattern could imply that the rings helped organise the use of fire somehow, perhaps as supports, boundaries, windbreak-like retainers within the chamber microenvironment, or simply as structured places around which activity was arranged. That is inference, not proof, but it is a grounded one because it begins from the site's most stubborn facts, built forms and heat traces in close association. That association between rings and fire is one of the strongest clues we have. Many of the spiller facts were blackened or reddened, and burnt organic material, including bone, was found nearby. The researchers did not present the fire as random contamination. They treated the heated zones as intentionally associated with the constructions. This makes it possible that the rings were part of managing light, heat, or activity in the chamber itself. In a deep cave, fire is more than warmth. It is visibility, orientation, and a way of creating a workable zone within darkness. A low annular arrangement could have helped define where people sat, where materials were placed, or where fire was tended. We do not know that this is what happened, but it is one of the more practical explanations available because it takes seriously the one thing the cave makes very hard to ignore. Stone and fire belong together there. Another possibility, and the one that most naturally captures the imagination, is that the deep setting itself mattered for reasons beyond ordinary utility. The original authors noted that based on most Upper Paleolithic cave incursions, one might assume some kind of symbolic or ritual behaviour. They immediately tempered that suggestion by asking whether unknown domestic use or refuge might instead explain the site. That balance is important. They did not declare Bruniquel a sanctuary. They simply acknowledged that deep cave visits in later prehistory are often associated with symbolic, cultural or funerary activities, and that the unusual depth and labour investment at Bruniquel invites similar questions. In short, a symbolic or ritual interpretation is not fantasy imported from nowhere. It is one of the possibilities the site itself raises. It is just not one that evidence can yet confirm. There are good reasons to tread carefully here. Later, Upper Paleolithic cave art and deep cave visitation by Homo sapiens come with other kinds of evidence. Engravings, paintings, carved forms, repeated imagery, clear traces of culturally patterned behaviour. Bruniquel has no painted bison waiting around a corner to settle the mood. What it has is more austere and in some ways more difficult. A place was made in darkness. Fire was used there. Space was organised into rings and smaller accumulations. That may well have had social or symbolic force, but the cave does not tell us how meaning was attached to those forms. If we call it ritual too quickly, we risk turning uncertainty into decoration. If we refuse to entertain symbolic possibilities at all, we risk becoming unrealistically narrow about what ancient people could have considered worth doing. The honest position lies somewhere in the middle. The site may have had symbolic or communal significance, but the evidence cannot yet tell us exactly what kind. What does seem likely, at least as an inference from the architecture itself, is that the builders were not only putting material somewhere, they were organising experience. A ring is a simple form, but it does something very specific. It creates an inside and an outside. It marks a boundary. It turns open floor into differentiated space. At Bruniquel, there are 2 main annular structures and 4 smaller accumulations, with 2 of those piles inside the larger ring and 2 outside it. That suggests a degree of internal order in the chamber. It may have been practical order. It may have been social order. It may have been both. But it is hard to see it as meaningless order. People do not generally invest this much labour deep underground merely to produce geometry for its own sake. The structures seem to have been used to make the chamber into a place with internal distinctions. That is already more than accident, and perhaps more than pure utility. This is one reason the site so often provokes the thought that perhaps the destination was the point. Not the cave as shelter in general, but this chamber specifically at this depth, beyond daylight, where the outside world had been fully stripped away. The 2016 paper emphasises the appropriation of deep karst space itself as unprecedented for a pre-modern human species. That phrase is worth lingering over. Appropriation of space means more than merely visiting it. It means taking hold of it behaviourally, making it part of one's world through action. At Bruniquel, that action included lighting, construction, and fire use in a dark chamber. So perhaps one answer to why build so deep underground is simply that the underground mattered as a setting. The cave was not just a container for the activity. The cave may have been one of the reasons for the activity. That possibility can be understood without drifting into mystical language. Deep caves are unusual environments. They remove ordinary sensory cues, compress vision into the range of flame, alter sound, and create a very strong sense of separation from the surface world. Even now, with modern gear, they do that. For Neanderthals around 176,500 years ago, entering such a place and then constructing within it would have been an intense collective experience. That does not prove ritual, but it does make some kind of socially meaningful action easier to imagine. A deep chamber is not a neutral room. It is a place that changes behaviour simply by being what it is. If people repeatedly went there and organised it, then they may have been using that altered environment deliberately, whether for gathering, marking, refuge with social significance, or purposes for which we do not yet have a good label. The site itself licenses that much inference, because the builders chose difficulty when easier settings surely existed above ground. There is also the matter of rarity. The Nature paper stressed that Neanderthal constructions in caves beyond the daylight zone were previously unknown, and even for later Upper Paleolithic cave visitors, substantial constructions are rare or absent. That means Bruniquel was not simply a routine cave use behaviour that happens to have survived unusually well. It stands out within the archaeological record. Rarity does not tell us what the site was for, but it does suggest the behaviour was not ordinary daily life in any simple sense. People were doing something there that was uncommon enough to leave us with no easy comparison. When archaeology loses its good analogies, interpretation becomes harder, but significance usually grows. Bruniquel matters partly because it does not fit comfortably into a familiar box. A practical mind might still ask whether water, stone, or cave climate played some technical role we have not yet identified. That remains possible. Caves have stable temperatures, special acoustics, mineral resources, and in some cases water or airflow conditions that can be useful in ways we do not immediately recognise from the surviving traces. The original authors explicitly left room for unknown domestic use. In a site this old, where organic materials, floor deposits, and the full behavioural context are only partially preserved, it would be reckless to declare that no hidden practical function existed. Archaeology is full of objects whose purposes looked mysterious, until further finds made them mundane, and full of supposedly mundane objects that turned out to be stranger than expected. Bruniquel deserves the same patience. If the cave eventually yields more associated evidence from under calcite or sediment, a technical explanation may become stronger. For now, though, it remains only one possibility among several. What seems least convincing is the idea that there was no real why. at all. The cumulative evidence pushes firmly against that. The structures were deliberately made from hundreds of pieces, partially calibrated, arranged in annular forms, and associated with intentionally heated zones. The researchers concluded that the site implies simultaneous realization of different tasks and therefore some degree of social organization. In other words, whatever the ultimate function was, this was organized behavior. It was not aimless wandering plus random breakage plus a lucky coincidence of fire. The hardest question at Bruniquel is not whether there was purpose. It is what kind of purpose could justify this kind of effort in this kind of place. And perhaps that is why the site remains so alive in the imagination of anyone who thinks about prehistory for too long before bed. If the answer were obvious, Bruniquel would be important, but calmer. Instead, it sits in that difficult middle ground where the facts are strong and the meaning remains open. A temporary refuge is possible, but the structures feel too deliberate to leave the matter there. A purely practical use is possible, but the depth and the form make it feel incomplete. Some symbolic or communal significance is possible, perhaps even likely in a broad sense, but the evidence does not permit a neat ceremonial script. So the best answer, for now, is not a tidy one. They built so deep underground because the chamber served a purpose significant enough to justify labour, fire, and repeated or sustained action in darkness. And that purpose may have combined practical and social elements in ways we cannot yet untangle cleanly. That may sound unresolved, but it is actually one of the strongest things about the site. Bruniquel forces us to take Neanderthal intention seriously without allowing us to domesticate it too quickly. The cave tells us they were not merely sheltering, not merely passing through, not merely surviving in the simplest sense, they were making a place. Why that place? Why those rings? Why that depth? We still do not fully know. But the very fact that the question remains difficult is part of what changed the picture of Neanderthals so much. Once you accept that they did this there, you can no longer keep them confined inside the old stereotype of people equal only to the most immediate tasks. They were operating in a harder and more deliberate world than that, and Bruniquel makes that uncomfortably clear. Which is why, once the question of purpose has been allowed to stay open without becoming vague, the next thing that follows is not just another theory about the cave. It is the larger realization of what this strange underground place did to our picture of Neanderthals themselves. What changed at Bruniquel was not only the cave, it was the frame around the cave. Before the dating results were published in 2016, the underground rings were already unusual. They had been discovered after cavers reopened the blocked entrance in 1990, and early work in the 1990s had shown that something deliberate seemed to be lying deep inside the chamber. But unusual is not the same as transformative. Archaeology is full of unusual things. It takes a particular combination of evidence, timing, and implication for one site to alter an entire public and scientific picture of a human group. Bruniquel did that because once the uranium-series dates placed the structures at around 176,500 years old, the builders could no longer be explained away as modern humans. At that age, in that region, the only known humans were Neanderthals. The discovery, therefore, forced a very direct conclusion. Deep in a French cave more than 100,000 years before Homo sapiens arrived in Europe, Neanderthals had already entered darkness, managed light, moved tons of material and built something structured there. That mattered because Neanderthals had long been treated unfairly, not only in popular imagination, but often in the assumptions built into scientific storytelling. A recent scholarly review describes how, from the 19th century onward, Neanderthals were burdened with images of brutishness, failure, and evolutionary dead-end status, shaped as much by Victorian prejudice and cultural ideology as by evidence. Even where the science had become more careful, the older image lingered. Neanderthals were often cast as competent enough to survive cold climates and hunt large animals, but somehow still one step short of the planning, symbolism, coordination, and technological flexibility that many people preferred to reserve for our own species. Bruniquel did not merely chip away at that picture, it made it look increasingly implausible. The reason is simple enough. a stereotype can survive a lot of vague contradiction. It has a harder time surviving a cave floor. Bruniquel offered something material, organised and difficult to reinterpret as accident or overenthusiasm. The Nature paper emphasised two unprecedented features of the site. First, it revealed the appropriation of deep cave space, including lighting, by a pre-modern human species. Second, it involved elaborate constructions made from hundreds of broken stalagmites that were deliberately moved and placed, together with intentionally heated zones. The authors concluded that the Neanderthal group responsible had a level of social organisation more complex than previously thought for this hominin. That sentence carries enormous weight because it is so restrained. It does not claim Neanderthals were identical to us in every respect. It does not claim to have solved the purpose of the structures. It simply states that the old low estimate of what they could organise was no longer adequate. Chris Stringer of the Natural History Museum, commenting on the discovery, made the broader implication even plainer. As summarised in coverage of the find, he said the Bruniquel structures provided clear evidence that Neanderthals had fully human capabilities in the planning and construction of stone structures. National Geographic's reporting on the site also quoted paleoanthropologist Eric Trinkhaus, calling the find solid and important documentation of advanced Neanderthal behaviour, while Jacques Joubert described the construction as requiring people to choose, lead, advise, manufacture, and work with continuous light. Those reactions are useful because they show how the site landed among specialists. This was not treated as a quirky footnote. It was treated as evidence strong enough to affect the larger conversation about Neanderthal minds and societies. Part of what made the discovery so disruptive was its date. If Bruniquel had turned out to be 50,000 years old, it would still have been impressive, but its impact would have been easier for some people to soften, because by then, Neanderthals are often imagined through the lens of their overlap with modern humans. At 176,500 years old, that comfort disappears. National Geographic noted that the rings predate the arrival of Homo sapiens in Europe by more than 100,000 years. That means Bruniquel cannot be explained as a late flourish, inspired by contact with our species. It belongs to Neanderthals on their own terms, in a much earlier Europe, during a period when many assumptions about advanced behaviour were once thought not to apply. That chronology is part of why the site changed so much. It did not merely show that Neanderthals could do something complex, it showed they could do it very early and independently. There is another layer to the discovery as well, and it concerns the setting. Before Bruniquel, regular Neanderthal incursions into deep caves beyond daylight were essentially unknown. The Nature paper itself says that until then no evidence had been found for regular Neanderthal cave incursions, except a possible case of footprints, and the 2026 entrance study reiterates that Bruniquel contains the oldest evidence of deep cave use by early Homo neanderthalensis. That matters because deep caves are demanding environments. They require lighting, route knowledge, fuel management, and a willingness to treat darkness as workable space. So Bruniquel did not simply add building to the Neanderthal record. It added deep subterranean building, with fire in a place where the cave entrance reconstruction suggests darkness would have begun quickly behind the opening. The discovery expanded not just what Neanderthals could make, but what kinds of environments they could intentionally occupy and organise. This is why the site has often been described as evidence of planning rather than merely evidence of dexterity. Picking up a stone tool is one thing. Breaking, calibrating, carrying and arranging around 400 stalagmite pieces with a total length of about 112 metres and a mass of roughly 2.2 tonnes is another. Doing so in a deep cave, with traces of fire on the structures themselves, requires a stack of capacities that the older stereotype did not grant very generously to Neanderthals: foresight, task coordination, a practical understanding of materials, and enough shared purpose to keep labour organised in darkness. National Geographic's coverage put it well by noting that the construction required reliable illumination, some kind of social organisation, and the ability to conceive of and build the patterns. Those are not magical capacities. They are ordinary human capacities, which is exactly why the discovery hit so hard. It forced many people to notice how much of ordinary human behaviour they had quietly denied to Neanderthals. The timing of Bruniquel also mattered because it arrived during a broader re-evaluation of Neanderthal abilities. By 2016, the old image was already weakening. Genetic work had shown that Neanderthals and modern humans interbred. Archaeological work had increasingly documented fire use, skilled tool traditions, care for injured individuals and other signs of social depth. But Bruniquel added a particularly striking kind of evidence because it was architectural and spatial. It did not rely on small traces that could be explained away as marginal or exceptional. It confronted researchers with a whole-built arrangement in a difficult place. In that sense, Bruniquel became one of the landmarks in a wider shift, not because it stood alone, but because it gave that shift one of its clearest visual forms. Later discoveries and syntheses only strengthened that broader shift. A 2020 Scientific Reports paper on a 3-ply cord fragment from Abri Dumara argued that direct evidence of Neanderthal fibre technology, added to evidence for birch bark, tar, art and shell beads, makes the idea that Neanderthals were cognitively inferior to modern humans increasingly untenable. That is a striking sentence from a peer-reviewed paper because it shows how much the field had moved. Bruniquel did not create that movement on its own, but it clearly belongs to it. So does evidence interpreted as ornament use, such as the Krapina eagle talons described in later analyses as a kind of jewellery worn by Neanderthals around 130,000 years ago. And reporting in Nature and Science on possible Neanderthal cave art in Spain helped push the same question further, even though some of those artistic claims remain debated. Taken together, the picture is not of one miraculous site, but of a record increasingly difficult to reconcile with the old brute cousin caricature. That said, Bruniquel is special even within that broader pattern. Many arguments about Neanderthal cognition have been fought over tiny traces, scratches on a surface, pigment on an object, possible ornaments, ambiguous deposits, traces of adhesives. Such evidence can be powerful, but it is also easy for debate to settle into technical quarrels over whether a mark is really symbolic, whether a stain is really decorative, whether a process is really complex enough to count. Bruniquel is harder to minimise that way. It presents a chamber in which deep cave use, construction, and fire use all converge. The structures are there, the heat traces are there, the dates are there, the depth is there. The question is not whether something extraordinary happened. The question is how extraordinary we are prepared to admit it was. That is one reason the site changed so many minds. It is much harder to wave away 2 tons of arranged speleofacts than it is to argue endlessly over one scratched line on a wall. It also changed public language, and that matters more than it may seem. After Bruniquel, journalists, museum communicators, and scientists themselves increasingly describe Neanderthals not as half-failed imitators of modern humans, but as people with their own cultural and technical strengths. Smithsonian's 2023 overview of Neanderthal research reflects this newer landscape. It treats evidence for engraving, personal adornment, and other non-utilitarian behaviours as serious parts of the discussion, while also acknowledging that Neanderthals may still have thought differently from Homo sapiens. That is a more mature position than the old binary. Bruniquel helped it along because it showed that one can reject the crude stereotype without needing to pretend all human groups were identical. Neanderthals did not have to be miniature modern humans in order to deserve a much richer account of their capacities. In some ways, then, the real discovery at Bruniquel was not the rings themselves. It was the inadequacy of the frame we'd been using. The site did not suddenly bestow intelligence on Neanderthals. It exposed how selective our older definitions of intelligence had been. We were comfortable recognizing strength, endurance, and hunting skill in ancient relatives. We were less comfortable recognizing deep environmental appropriation, structured use of underground space, and coordinated construction that could not easily be reduced to immediate subsistence. Bruniquel forced a small but significant correction. It suggested that some of the behaviours long treated as late, special, or uniquely ours were instead part of a wider human repertoire, expressed differently and earlier than many had assumed. This is one reason the cave still occupies such an interesting position in discussions of human evolution. It does not settle every argument about Neanderthal minds. It does not tell us whether their symbolic life matched ours, whether their language did, or whether their social worlds were organised in the same way. Those questions remain open and are likely to stay open. But Bruniquel narrowed the space in which the old dismissive answers could comfortably live. After a site like this, it becomes much harder to maintain that Neanderthals only reacted to the world in immediate practical ways, while modern humans alone transformed places through planning and shared intention. At Bruniquel, they very plainly transformed a place. They did so in darkness, they did so with fire, and they did so early enough that the usual fallback explanations no longer work very well. There is something almost amusing in the way this happened. So many grand arguments about human uniqueness get revised not by philosophy, but by dirt, calcite, and the patient work of people measuring minerals in caves. A collapsed entrance is dug through, a chamber is mapped, stalagmites are sampled, uranium decays into thorium with no concern for our species' pride. And out of that process comes a result that asks for a quieter, more generous account of who Neanderthals were. Not saints, not cartoons, not honorary Homo sapiens with flattering lighting. Just another humankind, capable of entering the underground dark and making a place there for reasons still partly hidden from us. That is a bigger change than it first appears, because once the stereotype loosens, many other parts of the record begin to look different too, and that may be the deepest legacy of the discovery. Bruniquel did not only change Neanderthals in the eyes of science, it changed us a little as well. It made modern humans less lonely in the past. It reminded us that the urge to shape space, to organise matter, to carry light into difficult places and leave behind a trace of shared intention is older and broader than our neat stories once allowed. The cave did not erase differences between kinds of humans, but it did make the family resemblance harder to ignore. Once you picture those structures in their chamber, once you accept their age, once you let the fact settle that they were made by Neanderthals long before our species entered Europe, the old joke about the dull caveman becomes harder to repeat with a straight face. And after that, what remains is not just the question of what they could do, but the quieter and more difficult feeling that deep in the cave, under calcite and silence, they had been waiting for us to notice all along. There is a particular kind of silence that belongs to caves, and Bruniquel seems to have kept hold of it better than most. Not because nothing ever happened there, quite the opposite, but because what did happen was shut away for so long that the cave had time to fold itself back over the evidence and leave it resting under calcite, darkness, and the ordinary patience of stone. When the site was finally reopened in 1990, the chamber still held ring-like constructions made from broken stalagmites, traces of fire, and a problem that would take years to solve properly. Once those structures were dated to about 176,500 years ago, and once the cave's entrance history showed the deep chamber had indeed lain beyond quickly vanishing daylight, Bruniquel stopped being just an odd underground site and became one of the clearest pieces of evidence that early Neanderthals were capable of deliberate deep cave construction and organised activity in darkness. That is a large claim, but by now it no longer feels like an exaggerated one. The facts themselves are large enough. The constructions lie 336 metres from the entrance. They were built from around 400 broken stalagmite pieces, with a total length of about 112 metres and a mass of roughly 2.2 tonnes. They include two annular structures and smaller associated accumulations. The traces of heat are real. The age estimate is not a guess, but the result of uranium-series dating on the stalagmites and calcite regrowth. And because the date falls so far before the arrival of modern humans in Europe, the builders are understood to have been Neanderthals. Still, what lingers after all the dating and measurement is not just the technical result. It is the human feeling of the place. Not human in the narrow modern sense, but human in the older family sense. Someone came here. Someone decided the chamber mattered. Someone entered with fire, moved material, made boundaries, and left the cave altered. The silence that followed was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of something completed and then abandoned to time. That difference matters. A lot of ancient places feel old. Fewer feel as though a decision is still sitting in them, and perhaps that is what makes Bruniquel such a good place to end this journey. Not because it solves everything, it does not. We still do not know exactly why the structures were built. We do not know whether the chamber served one purpose or several. We do not know whether the rings were tied to a practical use, a social one, a symbolic one, or some blend of all three. We do not know how many individuals took part, how often they returned, how long the fires burned, or what words, if any, were exchanged while the work went on. Those uncertainties remain, and they should remain. They are part of the integrity of the site. Bruniquel is most persuasive when it stays close to what the cave actually preserves. But uncertainty does not weaken the larger meaning. In some ways, it sharpens it. Because when a site leaves motive unresolved but action unmistakable, you are forced to take the action seriously. You cannot explain it away as fantasy, but you cannot reduce it to a neat little lesson either. The cave will not let you do either. It will not tell you a simple story about ritual. It will not tell you a simple story about shelter. It will not flatter modern people by making the builders look exactly like us, nor will it flatter old prejudices by making them look simple. It leaves us in the more demanding position of acknowledging minds we do not fully understand, at work in conditions we can still picture well enough to recognise as difficult. That is one of the most useful things archaeology can do. It can deny us easy comfort from both directions. We do not get to keep the old caricature of Neanderthal as creatures equal only to the most immediate tasks, because Bruniquel makes that too hard to maintain. But we also do not get to turn them into moderns in animal skins with all the same categories and intentions we happen to admire in ourselves. The site gives us a more disciplined form of respect. It says, in effect, these people were capable of organised, planned, cooperative action in a deep cave with lighting, fire and construction around 176,500 years ago. That is already enough to widen the frame. It does not need to be inflated into something more theatrical in order to matter. In truth, the widening of the frame may be the most important part. So much of the old human story was told as though everything valuable moved steadily upward toward us, like a staircase with modern Homo sapiens standing smugly at the top and everyone else arranged on lower steps. That picture was always too neat for the evidence, and Bruniquel is one of the sites that makes the neatness impossible to defend. Deep in a French cave, long before our species entered Europe, another kind of human had already learned enough about darkness, fire, movement, material and cooperation to do something there that still catches us off guard. If the staircase story cannot hold that comfortably, then perhaps the story needed changing more than the cave did. It is striking, too, how little the cave needed from us in order to make that point. No speeches, no art panel with a caption, no preserved face looking out from the shadows, just structures. Stone moved from one state into another. Heat traces where heat should not have been without intention. A chamber too deep for daylight to help. Calcite that kept growing after the builders were gone, and much later gave scientists the clock they needed to read the age. There is almost something stern about the simplicity of the evidence. The cave did not offer a dramatic manifesto. It offered measurements, mineral layers, and stubborn physical facts. Sometimes that is exactly what prehistory needs if it is going to overcome long-lived prejudice. And prejudice, in this case, has been a durable thing. Neanderthals were misunderstood for generations, not because the evidence truly required that misunderstanding, but because people are very good at building hierarchies and then mistaking them for nature. The old image of the dim brute was never just about fossils. It was also about what modern humans wanted evolution to look like. progressive, flattering, convenient, and arranged in a way that made us seem inevitable. Bruniquel does not fit that arrangement. It suggests instead that deep planning, hard-won competence, and the ability to shape an environment in a socially organised way were not cleanly reserved for us. They belong to a broader human story. That does not make the builders less distinct. In some ways, it makes them more distinct because once you stop forcing them into a crude category, they become easier to see as themselves. Neanderthals were not failed modern humans. They were Neanderthals, with their own bodies, their own histories, their own environments, and their own ways of solving problems. What Bruniquel shows is not that they were secretly identical to us, but that the distance between us and them was often drawn too lazily. They had depth, quite literally in this case. There is also something quietly moving about the fact that such a revelation comes from underground. We like to think of history as something found in bright places, inscriptions on sunlit stone, monuments standing in open air, ruins visible from a distance. But a great deal of the deep past survives because it was hidden, covered over, sealed, left out of sight while weather, villages, roads, and entire civilizations passed above. Bruniquel makes that feel almost personal. For more than 100,000 years after the cave closed naturally, the chamber held onto its evidence without being part of any later human world. Medieval people lived above it without knowing. Farmers and travellers passed through the region without knowing. Modern science itself took quite a while to know. The cave waited. That is what deep time often looks like when it meets patience, and deep time is a strange thing to sit with, because it changes scale in the mind. At first, 176,500 years feels like a number too large to hold properly. Then, slowly, it becomes a gap in which countless ordinary things happened and vanished. Fires burned and went out, bodies aged, weather shifted, species moved, rivers cut and recut their valleys, caves dripped, mineral films thickened, entrances collapsed, languages appeared and disappeared, villages rose, towers were built, roads spread, lights came on in houses. And all the while, in one sealed chamber beneath a French hillside, low rings of broken stalagmites remained exactly where they had been left. That is not mystical. It is simply what happens when geology and archaeology happen to cooperate. Perhaps that is why Bruniquel feels so calm even while it is unsettling. Some discoveries are dramatic in a loud way. They demand immediate revision and enjoy the fuss. Bruniquel is quieter. It asks more of you the longer you think about it. First, it surprises you. Then it corrects you. Then, if you stay with it long enough, it becomes oddly intimate. You start to picture not a species label, but a group in a chamber. Light being tended, stone being moved, a boundary slowly taking shape on the floor. Perhaps pauses, perhaps a tension shared between the structure, the flame, and the path back out. The more specific the image becomes, the less comfortable the old dismissive language feels. That may be the cave's deepest effect. It makes distance harder to maintain, and yet the distance remains. We do not get to know them fully. We do not get their names, if names in our sense are even the right way to think about it. We do not get the emotional tone of the event. We do not get the exact meaning of the rings. We do not get the conversations, the gestures, the teaching, the disagreements, the purpose as it was held in their own minds. The silence of deep time keeps those things. It gives us enough to know there was intention, but not enough to live inside that intention as they did. That is frustrating, certainly, but perhaps it is also fair. The past is not obliged to become transparent simply because we are curious. Still, there is comfort in knowing that some traces survive at all, not because they tell us everything, but because they tell us enough to resist forgetting. Bruniquel says that long before our own species became the dominant teller of the human story, there were already people making difficult spaces usable, gathering in them and leaving behind the remains of organised thought. That is not a small inheritance. It means the history of making places, of shaping environments to fit shared purposes, runs deeper than a great many surface histories suggest. The ring structures are humble by later standards, but humility in material does not mean humility in implication. There is also a lesson here about how science works when it is at its best. Not as a machine for producing neat certainty on demand, but as a patient way of narrowing doubt. Bruniquel was not understood in one dramatic flash. The cave was discovered in 1990. Early work documented the structures and recognised that they were important. A burnt bone hinted at great age. Then years passed. Research resumed. Uranium-series dating was applied. The chronology tightened. Later, the study of the cave entrance added independent support to the picture. Each step was careful. Each step reduced the space for easy dismissal. That is good science, though it is perhaps not the kind that lends itself to wild trumpet blasts. The result, however, is better for the patients. We can trust Bruniquel precisely because it was not rushed into meaning. And trust matters in a story like this because it allows the reflection to stay grounded. There is no need to pretend the cave proves every generous theory one could wish for about Neanderthals. It proves enough already. It proves that they appropriated a deep cave space, that they used lighting and fire there, that they built annular structures from broken stalagmites, and that they did so around 176,500 years ago, making Bruniquel the oldest known evidence of deep cave use by early Neanderthals. Once you sit with that, something shifts. The cave is still mysterious, the purpose is still open. But the emotional balance changes. Bruniquel becomes less a puzzle about whether Neanderthals were capable of more than we thought, and more a reminder that we were often thinking too narrowly to begin with. The discovery changed Neanderthals, yes, in the sense that it changed how modern science and modern audiences describe them, but perhaps more importantly, it changed the terms on which we talk about ancient minds at all. It asked us to be more careful with superiority, more cautious with assumptions, and a little more willing to find complexity where old habits expected simplicity. And so we arrive back, in a way, at the cave itself. Not as a curiosity now, but as a place that has done its work on us. A chamber in southwestern France sealed through much of the Pleistocene and reopened only recently in the long scale of things has made the human story slightly larger and less tidy. That is a good outcome. Tidy stories are often pleasant, but they are rarely strong enough for the truth. Bruniquel is stronger than tidy. It is awkward, specific, quiet, and persuasive. It leaves us with a deeper cave and a deeper prehistory than we had before. If you imagine that chamber now, imagine it without the modern lamps and diagrams. Imagine only the low structures, the blackened and reddened stone, the enclosed space, the sound of a cave holding itself together in the background. Imagine the fire, small but sufficient. Imagine the rest of the chamber beyond the light, still there and not there, the way darkness makes things. Then imagine the builders leaving, the flame taken or extinguished, the chamber returning to cold and black, calcite beginning eventually to grow again over what they had made. No witness left except the cave, no audience, no promise that anyone would ever come back. And yet someone did come back much later, from a species that likes to believe it understands its own beginnings. We came with better lamps, better clocks, and still not enough certainty to answer every question. But we came far enough to recognise something important. In the silence of deep time, the old chamber had not kept nothing. It had kept a record of intention. It had kept a small built world made by hands not our own, and yet not wholly unlike them either. So let me ask you, gently, the way these journeys often begin and end. Where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it in your part of the world right now? Funny, really. After spending so long with a place where daylight meant nothing and the clock was held in stone rather than in numbers, we still return to our own little signs of time so naturally. A late hour, a lamp in the room, a screen glowing softly, the day thinning out around you. And if this long walk into Bruniquel gave you some calm, or some company, or simply a slower way to think about the deep past before sleep, I'd be very glad if you liked the video and subscribed to Just About Earth. It helps this quiet corner find other people who enjoy wandering through old questions at a gentler pace. For now, though, it is enough just to leave the cave where it is, deep in the hills, sealed for ages, opened again, and still not quite finished with us. Somewhere under all that stone the rings waited without hurry, and now, having reached them, we can let the silence close back in, not empty this time, but full of the knowledge that long before our own familiar world, someone had already gone into the dark and made a place there,